When tech billionaire Evelyn Cross collapsed in a crowded restaurant, choking in seconds from death, dozens of witnesses froze in horror. But one man, a tired father in worn work clothes eating his first real meal in weeks, moved without hesitation and saved her life with his bare hands. Then he vanished before anyone could learn his name. What she discovered when she finally found him would shatter everything she believed about power, worth, and what it means to be a hero. If you want to know how a single moment of courage changed 2 lives forever and sparked a quiet revolution, stay with me until the very end. And please, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The restaurant hummed with the kind of low, sophisticated murmur that only money could buy. Crystal chandeliers cast warm amber light across white tablecloths, and the soft clink of silverware against fine china created a rhythm of refined civility. This was Luminaire, one of the city's most exclusive establishments, where reservations required weeks of advance notice and a willingness to spend what most people earned in a month. Evelyn Cross sat alone at a corner table, her posture perfect despite the exhaustion she carried like a second skin. At 42, she was the founder and CEO of Quantum Dynamics, a tech empire worth $3 billion. Her charcoal suit was tailored to perfection, her dark hair pulled back in a sleek twist that revealed the sharp angles of her face. She'd spent the day in back-to-back board meetings, navigating hostile investors and deflecting another takeover attempt. This dinner was supposed to be her reward: 2 hours of silence, exceptional food, and freedom from the constant demands of running an empire. She took a measured sip of her wine, letting the complexity unfold on her palate. Around her, the restaurant's other patrons leaned toward each other in intimate conversation, their laughter carefully modulated to avoid disturbing neighbors. Evelyn had specifically requested this table because it offered the illusion of privacy, tucked into an alcove where she could observe without being observed. Across the dining room, separated by perhaps 30 feet and an entire universe of circumstance, Mark Reynolds sat at a much smaller table near the kitchen doors. At 32, he looked older than his years. His face carried the particular weariness that comes from working 2 jobs while raising a child alone, the kind of tired that sleep never quite erased. His clothes were clean but noticeably worn, khakis that had seen too many wash cycles and a button-down shirt that had been carefully ironed despite fraying at the collar. This dinner represented something precious to Mark. For the first time in 8 months, his daughter Sophie was at a sleepover, and he'd received his quarterly bonus from the warehouse where he worked nights. Instead of immediately putting the money toward bills or Sophie's ever-growing medical expenses, he'd made an impulsive decision. He'd walked into Luminaire, fully expecting to be turned away, but the hostess had simply smiled and shown him to this table near the back. The menu prices had made his stomach clench, but he'd ordered anyway. The house special, a modest wine, nothing extravagant. Just one evening where he could sit in a beautiful space and eat food he hadn't microwaved or assembled from a drive-through bag. Just 2 hours where he wasn't Mark the warehouse worker, or Mark the struggling single dad, but simply a man enjoying a good meal. He watched the other diners with quiet fascination, noting the ease with which they inhabited this world. The couple 3 tables over didn't even glance at prices before ordering. The businessman near the window spoke on his phone with the casual confidence of someone who'd never worried about being overheard. And the woman in the corner, the one sitting alone with the bearing of royalty, she seemed to exist in a bubble of perfect, untouchable calm. Mark had no idea he was looking at Evelyn Cross. He didn't follow business news or recognize the faces that graced magazine covers. To him, she was simply another person in an expensive restaurant, living a life he couldn't imagine. The waiter approached Evelyn's table with practiced deference. "Your entree, Ms. Cross. Pan-seared Chilean sea, bass with a champagne beurre blanc, microgreens from our rooftop garden, and truffle-infused fingerling potatoes." "Thank you, Des," Evelyn said, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. She picked up her fork, examining the presentation with the critical eye of a perfectionist. Everything in her life had to be exceptional. Mediocrity was unacceptable, whether in quarterly earnings or plating aesthetics. She cut into the fish, appreciating the perfect sear, and brought the first bite to her lips. The flavors were exquisite, buttery, delicate, with subtle notes of truffle and lemon. She chewed slowly, savoring both the taste and the rare moment of solitude. Then something went wrong. The piece of fish seemed to catch in her throat, lodging with sudden, terrifying completeness. Evelyn's eyes widened as she tried to swallow, but nothing moved. She reached for her water glass, but her hand froze halfway there as panic overrode muscle memory. Her throat closed tighter. No air, no sound. She tried to cough, but her airway was completely blocked. The restaurant's ambient noise, the conversations, the music, the gentle clink of dishes, suddenly seemed very far away, muffled by the rushing sound in her ears. Evelyn stood abruptly, her chair scraping backward. Her hands went to her throat in the universal sign of choking, but her movements were already becoming uncoordinated. The woman who commanded boardrooms and made decisions affecting thousands of employees couldn't make her body obey the simplest command. Breathe. The couple at the nearest table noticed first. The woman's eyes widened. "Oh my God, is she—" "Someone help!" the man called out, his voice breaking the restaurant's sophisticated calm like a stone through glass. Heads turned. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. The gentle background music that had seemed so pleasant moments ago now felt obscene, cheerful notes playing over a developing tragedy. Evelyn stumbled, her hip catching the edge of her table. Wine glasses toppled, red liquid spreading across white linen like blood. She couldn't think clearly anymore. Her vision was starting to narrow, edges going dark. Somewhere in the back of her oxygen-starved mind, she registered the absurdity. She was Evelyn Cross. She'd survived hostile takeovers and ruthless competitors and the cutthroat world of Silicon Valley, and she was going to die choking on fish in a restaurant full of people. The maitre d' rushed forward, his professional composure cracking. "Does anyone know the Heimlich maneuver? Someone call 911!" A man in an expensive suit half rose from his chair, then sat back down, clearly hoping someone else would act. A woman pulled out her phone but seemed frozen, unsure whether to record or actually call for help. The businessman by the window stood but didn't move closer, his face pale with uncertainty. This was the strange reality of crisis among the comfortable. Surrounded by successful, educated people, Evelyn was dying because no one knew what to do or was willing to risk doing it wrong. Except one person. Mark had been cutting into his own meal, a far simpler dish than Evelyn's, but still the best thing he'd eaten in months when the commotion started. His head snapped up at the woman's cry, and his eyes immediately found Evelyn. He saw her hands at her throat, saw the panic in her eyes, saw the way she was swaying on her feet. He didn't think. Thinking took time Sophie didn't have when she had asthma attacks in the middle of the night. Thinking meant hesitation, and hesitation meant consequences he'd learned to avoid. Mark was moving before his conscious mind had fully registered the decision. His chair toppled backward as he stood. He crossed the restaurant in long, fast strides, dodging between tables with the efficiency of someone who'd spent years navigating crowded warehouse floors. "Excuse me, coming through?" he said, his voice calm but carrying absolute authority. The crowd parted instinctively, responding to his certainty. He reached Evelyn just as her knees started to buckle. Up close, he could see the blue tinge starting at her lips, could see that her eyes, though wide with fear, were beginning to lose focus. Seconds. That's all he had. Maybe not even that. "Ma'am, I'm going to help you," Mark said, positioning himself behind her. His voice was steady, the same tone he used when Sophie woke up gasping for air at 2 a.m., calm, confident, capable. "This is going to feel uncomfortable, but I need you to trust me." He wrapped his arms around her midsection, one hand forming a fist just above her navel, the other grasping it firmly. He could feel her rib cage expanding as her body desperately tried to draw air that wouldn't come, could feel the fine tremors running through her as panic and oxygen deprivation took hold. Evelyn's hands clutched at his arms, her grip surprisingly strong despite her weakening state. In some distant part of her fading consciousness, she registered the worn fabric of his shirt, the callous strength of his hands, the solid certainty of his presence behind her. Mark pulled inward and upward with controlled force, delivering the first thrust of the Heimlich maneuver exactly as he'd learned it from the free CPR class at Sophie's school. Nothing. He repositioned slightly, adjusted his grip, and delivered a second thrust, harder this time. The restaurant had gone completely silent except for someone's phone clattering to the floor and the distant sound of sirens. The 911 call was already working its way through the system, ambulance en route, but too slow, far too slow. Third thrust. Mark felt Evelyn's body jerk against his, felt her try to draw breath and fail. His own heart was pounding now, but his hands remained steady. He'd done this before with Sophie, had saved his daughter's life 3 times when she was younger, and before they'd gotten her asthma under control. He knew what failure looked like, and he wasn't going to let it happen here. "Come on," he murmured, so quietly only Evelyn could have heard if she'd still been fully conscious. "Come on, you're not done yet." Fourth thrust, this one with every ounce of controlled strength he possessed. The obstruction dislodged. The piece of fish shot from Evelyn's throat and landed on the carpet several feet away. For one terrible second, nothing else happened, and then Evelyn drew in a great, gasping, ragged breath. The sound of it seemed to fill the entire restaurant, raw and desperate and absolutely beautiful. She sagged against Mark, her legs unable to support her weight. He lowered them both carefully to the floor, keeping one arm around her shoulders as she coughed and gasped, drawing in oxygen like someone who'd just surfaced from deep water. "That's it," Mark said softly, his hand steady on her back. "Just breathe, nice and slow. You're okay now." The restaurant erupted. Applause broke out, scattered at first and then building to a crescendo. Voices overlapped in excited chatter, everyone suddenly wanting to narrate what they'd just witnessed, to claim some small part of the drama. "Did you see that? He saved her life. That was incredible. Someone get him a drink, get him whatever he wants." The maitre d' appeared at Mark's side, his face flushed with relief and gratitude. "Sir, I cannot thank you enough. That was extraordinary. Please. You and the lady, your meals are absolutely on the house. But Mark was already standing, gently steadying Evelyn before releasing her into the care of a waiter who'd rushed over with a chair. Evelyn looked up at him, her face still pale but color returning, her eyes now sharp and focused despite the trauma she'd just endured. She tried to speak, but her throat was raw, the words emerging as barely more than a whisper. "Wait, I need to... Thank you." Mark shook his head, already backing away. The attention was becoming overwhelming. People were standing now, some with phones out, cameras pointed in his direction. The last thing he wanted was to become a spectacle, to have his face plastered across social media, to have Sophie see her dad in videos with people calling him a hero when he'd just done what anyone should do. "You don't need to thank me," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I'm just glad you're all right. But I don't even know your name." "You don't need to," Mark replied. He glanced at the gathering crowd, at the phones, at the maitre d' who was clearly about to launch into more effusive gratitude. "Just take care of yourself, okay?" He turned and walked away, navigating back through the tables toward his own abandoned meal. Behind him, the excited chatter continued. People already constructing narratives about what they'd witnessed, each version slightly different, drama building with each retelling. The maitre d' followed him, practically stumbling in his haste. "Sir, please, at least let me... Your meal... We'll prepare anything you'd like. The finest wine, dessert, absolutely everything." "That's kind of you," Mark said, reaching his table and pulling out his wallet. "But I should probably go. How much do I owe for what I ordered?" The maitre d' looked offended. "Sir, after what you just did, you couldn't possibly... We couldn't accept..." Mark placed 3 $20 bills on the table, more than enough to cover his modest order plus a generous tip. "I appreciate it. I really do. But I'd rather just pay and head home." He could see the man wanted to argue, but something in Mark's expression, a quiet dignity, a firm unwillingness to be made into something he wasn't, stopped him. The maitre d' nodded slowly, accepting the bills with obvious reluctance. "At the very least," he said, "please allow me to give you my card. If you ever wish to dine with us again, it would be our honor to host you." Mark accepted the card to be polite, knowing he'd never use it. This wasn't his world, and one emergency didn't change that. He glanced once more toward the corner where Evelyn now sat, surrounded by concerned staff and fellow diners. Their eyes met across the room for just a moment. She raised one hand slightly, a gesture that might have been acknowledgement or gratitude or simply farewell. Mark nodded once and left through the main entrance, stepping out into the cool evening air. The street was quieter than the restaurant had been, normal city sounds replacing the drama he'd left behind. He stood for a moment, letting his heart rate settle, his hands still slightly shaky from adrenaline. His phone buzzed. A text from Sophie's friend's mother. Having a great time. Sophie's already asleep. No rush picking her up in the morning. Mark smiled despite everything, relief flooding through him. Sophie was safe, happy, enjoying a normal childhood moment. That was what mattered. Not the scene in the restaurant, not the woman whose life he'd saved, not the attention he'd just fled. Just Sophie, sleeping peacefully, unburdened by worry or responsibility. He started walking toward the bus stop, his hands in his pockets, already mentally shifting back to his regular life. Tomorrow he'd be back at the warehouse, loading trucks and processing inventory. Tomorrow this would be a strange story he might tell Sophie someday, when she was older. Tomorrow everything would be normal again. He had no idea that normal had just ended forever. Inside Luminaire, Evelyn sat in the chair the waiter had provided, a glass of water in her trembling hands. Her throat ached, her chest felt bruised, and she was acutely aware of how close she'd come to dying. But more than any of that, she was aware of the absence of the man who'd saved her. "Miss Cross, the ambulance is here," her assistant said, appearing from nowhere with the efficiency that made her invaluable. Rachel must have been called the moment the incident started. "They want to check you over, and I really think—" "I'm fine," Evelyn said, her voice rough but functional. "I don't need—" "With respect, you absolutely do need medical attention," Rachel interrupted, one of the few people who could get away with contradicting Evelyn Cross. "You just choked and nearly died. Protocol requires—" "Fine." Evelyn stood, accepting the arm Rachel offered for support. Her legs were steadier now, but the adrenaline was fading, leaving exhaustion in its wake. "But first I need to know who that man was. The one who—" "Already working on it," Rachel said, guiding her toward the entrance where paramedics were setting up. "I've got the restaurant pulling up his reservation, credit card receipt, anything they have. We'll find him." But when Rachel made the inquiries, she hit an immediate wall. The maitre d' checked his records, confusion creasing his features. "That's odd. He didn't have a reservation. Walk in. Paid cash for his meal before he left." He paused, checking again. "I gave him my card, but he didn't give me his name. I'm sorry, Ms. Cross. I didn't think to ask." Evelyn felt something strange stirring in her chest. Not just gratitude, but genuine curiosity. In her world, everyone wanted something. Favors, connections, opportunities, recognition. She'd built her empire understanding that fundamental truth about human nature. People didn't act without expecting returns. But this man, this stranger in worn clothes who'd moved with such certainty, who'd saved her life with such competence, had walked away from the attention, the free meals, the opportunity to network with one of the country's wealthiest CEOs. He'd refused the spotlight and disappeared back into anonymity as if saving lives was just something he did between courses. "Someone must have recorded it," Rachel said, already scrolling through social media on her phone. "People were filming. We'll find footage, identify him from that." "Do it," Evelyn said. Then, as the paramedics approached with their equipment, she added more quietly, "I need to thank him properly. I need to know who he is." The lead paramedic, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes, began her assessment. "Ms. Cross, I'm going to ask you some questions and check your vitals. Can you tell me exactly what happened?" As Evelyn recounted the incident, she found herself focusing not on the terror of choking, but on the moment the stranger's arms had wrapped around her. The calm authority in his voice, the absolute certainty of his movements, the way he'd known exactly what to do while everyone else had frozen. "You're very lucky," the paramedic said, checking Evelyn's oxygen levels. "Another 30 seconds, and this could have ended very differently. The person who helped you, was it someone you knew?" "No," Evelyn said softly. "A complete stranger." "Then you're lucky twice over," the paramedic replied. "Most people panic in situations like that. Even people who know the Heimlich maneuver theoretically often can't execute it under pressure. Whoever helped you has either been trained extensively or has done it before." Or both, Evelyn thought. Something about the man's demeanor had suggested experience, the kind that came from real emergencies, not certification courses. She thought about his clothes, clean but worn, the kind people bought at discount stores and wore until they fell apart. The calluses she'd felt on his hands, the way he'd refused recognition. This wasn't a good Samaritan looking for positive PR or a networking opportunity. This was someone who'd helped because helping was necessary, then left because staying would have been uncomfortable. It had been a very long time since Evelyn had encountered anyone who didn't want something from her. "I'd like to transport you to the hospital for observation," the paramedic was saying. "Injuries from choking aren't always immediately apparent, and—" "I'll go," Evelyn agreed, surprising both the paramedic and Rachel. Normally, Evelyn argued against anything that disrupted her schedule, but tonight she was tired, shaken, and acutely aware of her own mortality. "But Rachel stays with me, and she keeps working on finding that man." "Already on it," Rachel confirmed, her fingers flying across her phone screen. "First posts are going up now. Mystery hero saves tech CEO. Twitter's already building a narrative." Evelyn closed her eyes briefly, both grateful for and exhausted by the machinery of modern attention. Within hours, this would be a trending story. Within days, someone would identify the stranger from footage or photos. Her PR team would spin it, her competitors would analyze it, and the man who'd wanted nothing but to slip away quietly would be dragged into the spotlight whether he liked it or not. Part of her felt guilty about that. But a larger part, the part that had built an empire through relentless determination, needed to find him, needed to thank him, needed to understand why someone would save a stranger's life and then refuse the world's gratitude. As the paramedics helped her into the ambulance, Evelyn took one last look at Luminaire. The restaurant had returned to its normal rhythm, the crisis already becoming a story people would tell for weeks. Her overturned table had been cleared and reset. The wine stain would be dealt with by morning. Everything would go back to how it was. But Evelyn knew she couldn't. Something had shifted in that moment when death had seemed certain and a stranger's hands had pulled her back. Some fundamental assumption about the world and the people in it had cracked. She'd spent 20 years believing that everyone had an angle, that altruism was just enlightened self-interest in disguise, that kindness always came with strings attached. It was how you survived in business, how you protected yourself from being used. But the man who'd saved her life had had the perfect opportunity to leverage her gratitude, and he'd walked away from it without hesitation. Evelyn leaned back against the ambulance stretcher, feeling the vehicle's movement as it pulled away from the restaurant. Rachel sat beside her, still working her phone with single-minded focus. "Got something," Rachel said suddenly. "Short video, 23 seconds, posted 4 minutes ago. You can't see his face clearly, but—" She held up her phone. Evelyn watched the shaky footage, seeing herself from an outside perspective for the first time, seeing how completely she'd collapsed, how genuinely dire the situation had been, and seeing him, moving with purpose through the frozen crowd, positioning himself with practiced efficiency, executing the Heimlich with textbook precision. Then the moment when she'd gasped that first breath and he'd lowered them both to the floor, his hand steady on her back, his voice too quiet for the video to capture. The way he'd stood and backed away almost immediately, discomfort written in every line of his body as applause built around him. "Run facial recognition," Evelyn said. "Pull the clearest frame and send it to our security team. Someone at Quantum must have software that can enhance it." "Already in progress," Rachel confirmed. "Though his face is partially blocked in every angle I've found so far, he seemed to instinctively avoid direct camera exposure." Interesting, Evelyn thought. Not the behavior of someone seeking attention, not the behavior of most people at all in the age of social media, where everyone performed their lives for invisible audiences. The ambulance pulled up to the emergency room entrance. As the doors opened and Evelyn was wheeled inside, she made a decision. She would find this man. She would thank him properly. And if he needed anything at all, she would make sure he got it. It was the least she could do for someone who'd given her back her life and asked for nothing in return. She just had no idea yet that finding him would be the easy part. Understanding him would be something else entirely. The video went viral before midnight. Rachel sat in the hospital waiting room, her laptop balanced on her knees, watching the numbers climb with the detached fascination of someone who'd spent years managing digital narratives. Views, shares, comments, all multiplying at exponential rates as the algorithm picked up the story and fed it to millions of screens across the country. "Mystery hero saves billionaire CEO and vanishes," read one headline. Another proclaimed the man who refused fame after saving a life. A third, more cynical, "Tech CEO chokes. Unknown savior disappears. Who is he?" The comment sections were already building their own mythology. Some praised the mystery man's humility. Others speculated about his motives. Was he hiding something, running from the law, avoiding child support? A few insisted the whole thing was staged, that nothing genuine could happen without cameras and contracts prearranged. Rachel filtered through it all with practiced efficiency, flagging the useful information and discarding the noise. 3 different angles of video now, none with a clear shot of the man's face. Dozens of eyewitness accounts, each slightly different, drama inflating with each retelling. And buried in the comments of the second video, one detail that made her pause. A user named JennyM_1987 had written, "That looks like the guy who works night shift at Riverside Logistics. Same build, same walk. He's there when I drop my brother off for his shift." Rachel immediately cross-referenced Riverside Logistics, a mid-sized warehouse and distribution center on the industrial side of town. She made a note, sent a message to Quantum's security team, and glanced toward the examination room where Evelyn was being observed. Inside, Evelyn sat on the edge of the hospital bed, tolerating the nurse's final checks with barely concealed impatience. The doctor had already cleared her, bruised ribs, strained throat, instructions to rest and stay hydrated, but no serious damage. She'd been lucky, he'd said, using that word again. Lucky that someone had known what to do. Lucky that he'd acted quickly. Lucky to be alive. "You can go home now, Ms. Cross," the nurse said, making notes on a tablet. "But I want you to promise me you'll actually rest. No work for at least 48 hours. "Of course," Evelyn lied smoothly. She had board presentations in 3 days and a product launch to finalize. Rest was a luxury she couldn't afford, near-death experience or not. The nurse gave her a look that suggested she'd heard similar promises from driven professionals before and knew exactly how much they were worth. "The discharge papers will be ready in a few minutes. Your assistant said your car is already here." Evelyn nodded, already mentally cataloging the work that had piled up during her absence. But underneath the familiar rhythm of professional obligations, something else nagged at her, the image of the stranger's face, half turned away from cameras, and the question that wouldn't leave her alone. Who was he? Rachel appeared in the doorway, laptop under one arm, phone in the other hand, the posture of someone with news. "We might have a lead. Someone thinks they recognize him from a warehouse job. I've got people checking employment records now." "Good." Evelyn stood, accepting the bag of personal items Rachel handed her. "I want to know by morning. You should also know that the story's gotten bigger. It's trending on 3 platforms. Entertainment Tonight wants a statement, so does the local news. Your PR team has drafted something appropriately grateful and mysterious, plays well with the narrative." "Send it," Evelyn said, though part of her bristled at the manipulation. This was her life that had been saved, not a marketing opportunity. But she'd learned long ago that refusing to shape narratives just meant someone else shaped them for you, and rarely in your favor. They walked through the hospital corridor together, Rachel automatically clearing their path with a combination of authority and strategic positioning. A few people recognized Evelyn, did double takes, whispered to companions. One young man actually pulled out his phone before the sharp look Rachel gave him made him reconsider. The town car was waiting at the entrance, Evelyn's regular driver holding the door. Marcus had worked for her for 6 years and knew better than to ask questions when she looked like this, exhausted and irritable and in no mood for small talk. "Home, Ms. Cross?" he asked quietly. "Office," Evelyn said, ignoring Rachel's sharp intake of breath. "I need to check on a few things before—" "With respect, you need sleep," Rachel interrupted. "The doctor said rest. Your body just experienced trauma, and you're no good to anyone if you collapse from exhaustion." Evelyn wanted to argue. The instinct to push through, to never show weakness, was bone deep after 20 years of fighting for every inch of success in a male-dominated industry. But she was tired in a way that went beyond physical. The adrenaline crash had left her hollow, and her throat ached with every swallow. "Fine. Home," she conceded, sliding into the car. "But I want updates every hour on the search." "Every 3 hours," Rachel countered, getting in beside her. "You need actual sleep, not to be checking your phone all night." Evelyn didn't respond, which Rachel correctly interpreted as reluctant agreement. As Marcus pulled away from the hospital, Evelyn stared out the window at the city sliding past. Late-night traffic, illuminated storefronts, people going about their normal lives completely unaware that hers had just been saved by a stranger. "Rachel," she said after a moment, "why do you think he left?" Rachel looked up from her phone, surprise flickering across her features. Evelyn rarely asked questions she didn't already know the answer to. Some people don't want attention, or maybe he had somewhere to be. He refused free meals at one of the city's finest restaurants, refused recognition, refused to even give his name. Evelyn kept her gaze on the window. In my experience, everyone wants something, but he didn't. Maybe his thing is not wanting things, Rachel suggested. Some people are just genuinely humble. Or he's hiding something. You don't really believe that. It wasn't a question. Evelyn didn't answer because Rachel was right. Whatever else the stranger might be, her instincts, honed by decades of reading people, of identifying threats and opportunities, said he wasn't hiding criminal intent. He was hiding himself, which was different, more interesting. They drove in silence for several minutes before Rachel spoke again. "The warehouse lead is looking promising, by the way. Riverside Logistics has about 80 employees on night shift. Security team should be able to narrow it down by morning. We can have a name by tomorrow afternoon." "And then?" Rachel hesitated. "Then what? We send him a thank you card, offer him money?" "I'm honestly not sure what the protocol is for this situation." Evelyn wasn't sure either, which was a rare and uncomfortable feeling. She was a woman who operated on clear objectives and defined outcomes. But this situation defied her normal frameworks. You couldn't exactly send a fruit basket to someone who'd saved your life. And given his refusal of recognition, showing up with money would likely be insulting. "We find him first," Evelyn said finally. "Figure out the rest after that." The car pulled up to her building, a converted industrial space in the city's revitalized waterfront district. Expensive, minimalist, the kind of place featured in architecture magazines. Evelyn thanked Marcus and headed upstairs, Rachel following to make sure she actually made it to her apartment. "I'll be fine from here," Evelyn said at her door, recognizing Rachel's protective hovering for what it was. "Text me when you're settled," Rachel insisted. "And remember, no work emails, no midnight strategy sessions, actual rest." "Good night, Rachel." Alone in her apartment, Evelyn stood in the dark for a long moment before turning on the lights. The space was beautiful in the way of places designed to impress rather than comfort. High ceilings, exposed brick, furniture that cost more than most people's cars. She'd bought it because it made a statement about her success, but she'd never quite managed to make it feel like home. She poured herself a glass of water, mindful of the doctor's instructions, and sat on her designer couch with her laptop. She knew she should sleep, but her mind was too active, thoughts circling back to the restaurant, to those seconds when everything had gone dark and she'd felt certain she was dying, and to the stranger who'd pulled her back from that edge without hesitation. Her phone buzzed. A text from her mother, who somehow always knew when something happened despite Evelyn's best efforts to manage information flow. "I saw the news. Are you all right? Call me when you can." Evelyn stared at the message, debating whether to respond now or wait until morning when she'd have the energy for her mother's particular brand of concerned interrogation. She was still deciding when her phone rang, her mother not willing to wait. "I'm fine," Evelyn said by way of greeting. "You nearly died choking in a restaurant." Her mother's voice carried the sharp clarity of someone who'd raised 3 children mostly alone after divorce. "That doesn't qualify as fine. I'm home, I saw a doctor, I'm perfectly healthy. It was just a freak accident." "The news is saying some mystery man saved you and then disappeared. Is that accurate?" Evelyn found herself smiling despite everything. Surprisingly, yes. The news actually got something right for once. "Do you know who he was?" "Not yet. We're working on it." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Evelyn could almost hear her mother's thoughts organizing themselves. "You're going to find him and try to repay him somehow." "I'm going to thank him properly, yes." "Evelyn," her mother's tone shifted to something gentler, more concerned. "Not everyone wants to be found. If this man left without giving his name, maybe he has his reasons." "I'm not going to hurt him," Evelyn said, a touch of defensiveness creeping into her voice. I just want to express my gratitude. I know, sweetheart, but be careful that gratitude doesn't turn into something else. People who save our lives can become larger than life in our minds. We project onto them qualities they may not actually have. Evelyn wanted to argue, but she was too tired for the philosophical debate her mother was clearly ready to have. I'll be careful, I promise. And you'll actually rest? Not work yourself into the ground like you usually do after a crisis? I'm literally sitting on my couch doing nothing right now. With your laptop open, I'm guessing. Evelyn glanced at the laptop screen, still displaying the viral video of her rescue. I'll rest. Call you tomorrow. After they hung up, Evelyn did close the laptop, but she couldn't stop thinking about her mother's warning. Was she projecting? Building up this stranger into some kind of hero because she needed to believe someone could act without ulterior motives? She touched her throat, feeling the tenderness there, remembering the absolute certainty in the stranger's voice when he'd said, I'm going to help you. Beata, no hesitation, no doubt, just calm competence in the face of her panic. Whatever else he might be, he'd known exactly what to do when it mattered most. And that was real, not projection. Evelyn finally went to bed around 2 a.m., her mind still active but her body demanding rest. She fell asleep thinking about calloused hands and a voice that had promised help and delivered it. Across the city, in a modest apartment complex that would never make architecture magazines, Mark Reynolds sat on his daughter's bed watching her sleep. He'd picked Sophie up from the sleepover an hour ago, and she'd chattered the entire drive home about her friend's new puppy and the movie they'd watched and the breakfast they'd had. Normal, happy, 8-year-old concerns. She had no idea what had happened at the restaurant. He hadn't told her, wouldn't tell her. It wasn't relevant to her world, and Mark wanted to keep it that way. Sophie stirred, her small face peaceful in sleep. She looked like her mother, same delicate features, same dark curls, and the resemblance still caught Mark off guard sometimes, even though Sarah had been gone for 3 years. Cancer, aggressive and merciless, taking her before Sophie was old enough to form lasting memories. Mark had promised Sarah, in those final awful weeks, that he'd make sure Sophie had a good life, that she'd never feel like she was missing anything, that she'd grow up knowing she was loved and safe and capable of anything. He'd kept that promise, even when it meant working double shifts, even when it meant sacrificing his own needs and wants, even when exhaustion felt like a permanent state of being. Sophie was happy, healthy, and thriving. That was all that mattered. His phone buzzed on the nightstand, a text from Darius, his supervisor at the warehouse. Dude, you're blowing up online. When were you going to tell me you saved a billionaire? Mark's stomach dropped. He grabbed the phone, opened the link Darius had sent, and watched himself on a stranger's phone camera, performing the Heimlich maneuver in an expensive restaurant. The video had been viewed 1.3 million times. The comments were already spiraling into speculation and narrative building. He scrolled through more links, feeling increasingly trapped. News articles, Twitter threads, Reddit discussions. Someone had already started calling him the Invisible Hero, and the name was catching on. There were entire comment chains dedicated to identifying him, people trading theories and comparing screenshots. One commenter had posted, "Pretty sure this is the guy from Riverside Logistics. I've seen him there." Mark closed his eyes, dread settling in his chest like a physical weight. He tried to slip away quietly to avoid exactly this kind of attention, but it hadn't mattered. In the age of universal surveillance, privacy was an illusion. Someone was going to identify him. Maybe by tomorrow, maybe by next week, but it was inevitable. Another text, this time from his friend Lisa, who worked the morning shift at Sophie's school. "Mark, I just saw you on the news. Are you okay? Is Sophie okay?" He typed back quickly. "We're fine." It was nothing, really, just helped someone who needed it. "Nothing? You saved that tech CEO's life. They're calling you a hero." Mark didn't respond. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt like someone who'd done the obvious thing. Someone had been choking. He'd known how to help, so he'd helped. The same thing he'd do for Sophie or Lisa or a complete stranger on the street. It didn't make him special. It made him a decent human being, which should have been the baseline, not something worthy of viral videos. His phone kept buzzing. More texts, more links, more people who'd seen the video and recognized him or thought they had. His sister in Ohio. A former coworker. Sophie's pediatrician. Mark silenced the phone and set it face down on the nightstand. In the morning, he'd figure out how to handle this. Right now, he just wanted to sit with his daughter and pretend the outside world didn't exist. But even as he thought it, he knew the pretense was over. The video had been seen by millions. The woman he'd saved was Evelyn Cross, whose company had more resources than some countries. If she wanted to find him, she would. The question was what happened after that. Mark had never wanted money or fame or recognition. He wanted to provide for Sophie, to give her stability and love and a chance at a future better than his present. He wanted to work his shifts, pay his bills, and live quietly without anyone paying attention to the man loading boxes in a warehouse at 2 a.m. But apparently, saving someone's life meant giving up the right to anonymity, even if you didn't want credit, even if you tried to walk away. Sophie shifted in her sleep, and Mark automatically adjusted her blanket, tucking it around her small shoulders. Whatever happened next, he'd handle it the way he handled everything, by focusing on what actually mattered and ignoring everything else. The world could call him a hero or a mystery or whatever narrative they wanted to build. It didn't change who he was or what his responsibilities were. He was Sophie's dad. Everything else was just noise. By morning, Rachel had a name. She called Evelyn at 7 a.m., knowing her boss would already be awake despite the late night and medical trauma. Mark Reynolds, 32 years old, works night shift at Riverside Logistics. Single father to an 8-year-old daughter. No criminal record, no outstanding debts, no social media presence to speak of. Evelyn sat up in bed, instantly alert. How certain are we? 95%. We cross-referenced employee photos from the warehouse, matched them to the clearest frames from the video, and got a positive ID. One of our security consultants actually knows the warehouse manager, confirmed Reynolds was scheduled last night but called in, said he had something to take care of. Timeline matches perfectly. Address? Rachel rattled off an apartment complex in a working-class neighborhood on the east side of town. The kind of place where rent was affordable because everything else wasn't. Schools struggled, infrastructure was aging, opportunities were limited. Evelyn absorbed this information, feeling pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. A warehouse worker on night shift would have the kind of hands she'd felt, calloused from physical labor. A single father would have the competence that came from handling emergencies alone, no backup. Someone living paycheck to paycheck would wear clothes until they fell apart and see dinner at Luminaire as a rare extravagance worth splurging on. What do you want me to do with this information? Rachel asked carefully. Good question. Evelyn could send flowers, a generic thank you card, money, all of which felt simultaneously inadequate and potentially insulting. She could do nothing, respect his clear desire for anonymity, let him fade back into his normal life. Or she could do what every instinct told her to do. Meet him face to face, look him in the eye, and try to understand who this man actually was. Nothing yet, Evelyn said, though she was already planning. I need to think about the right approach. The press is still building the story, Rachel warned. Someone's going to identify him publicly soon if they haven't already. You might want to reach out before that happens and he gets mobbed. She was right. Once his name went public, Mark Reynolds would be dealing with interview requests, social media harassment, people showing up at his workplace and home. The circus Evelyn had inadvertently created by being saved. Give me until this afternoon, Evelyn said. I'll decide by then. After hanging up, she sat in bed with her laptop, pulling up everything the internet had to offer about Mark Reynolds. It wasn't much. No Facebook, no Instagram, no Twitter, no LinkedIn. A digital ghost in an age where everyone performed their lives online. She found a newspaper article from 5 years ago, a human interest piece about a community fundraiser. Mark Reynolds had organized a toy drive for children's hospitals, motivated by his daughter's extended stays during her treatment for severe asthma. The accompanying photo showed a younger version of the man from the restaurant, holding a small girl with dark curls and a bright smile. Another search turned up public records, marriage license from 9 years ago, death certificate for Sarah Ann Reynolds 3 years later. Evelyn did the math. Mark had been widowed at 29, left to raise a young daughter alone. She found his employment history through less official channels, a community college dropout, a series of jobs in warehousing and logistics, steady work but nothing spectacular, no ambition for management, no night school for advancement, just consistent employment at places that offered health insurance and flexible scheduling. A man who'd prioritized stability over success, who'd built his life around his daughter's needs rather than his own advancement, who'd walked away from an opportunity to network with a billionaire CEO because he genuinely hadn't wanted anything from her. Evelyn closed the laptop, feeling something she rarely experienced, uncertainty about how to proceed. This wasn't a business negotiation where she could leverage power and resources. This was a person who'd helped her in a moment of desperate need and then deliberately chosen invisibility over reward. Her phone rang. Her PR director calling with the morning's media update. 3 major outlets want interviews, David said without preamble. Good Morning America, local news, and a podcast with 5 million subscribers. They want the story. You, the choking incident, the mystery hero. It's a perfect human interest angle. I'm not doing interviews about this, Evelyn said flatly. With respect, we should capitalize on the positive coverage. You're trending for saving a life. Well, being saved. But the narrative is still sympathetic. It's good PR. David, I nearly died. This isn't a PR opportunity. Everything's a PR opportunity if you frame it correctly. He paused, recognizing he'd pushed too far. But I understand if you'd prefer to keep this private. We can issue a statement thanking the public for their concern and leave it at that. Do that, Evelyn agreed, and make sure the statement emphasizes that I want to respect the privacy of the person who helped me. No speculation about his identity, no calls for him to come forward. Make it clear that we're not participating in the circus. Understood. Though I should warn you, someone's going to identify him regardless of what we say. The internet doesn't respect privacy requests. I know. Evelyn ended the call, already composing her next message. She texted Rachel. I want to meet with him, today if possible. But quietly. No press, no security detail, just me. Can you arrange it? The response came quickly. Are you sure that's wise? We don't actually know this person. He saved my life. I think I owe him the benefit of the doubt. Meeting him in public then. Coffee shop, neutral territory? Agreed. Evelyn stood, heading to her closet to choose an outfit. Not the power suit she wore to intimidate competitors. Not the casual luxury she wore to galas. Something normal, approachable. The kind of thing that wouldn't immediately scream wealth and power. She settled on dark jeans and a simple sweater, minimal jewelry, understated. Then she looked at herself in the mirror and laughed quietly at the absurdity. Evelyn Cross trying to dress down to meet a warehouse worker who'd saved her life and didn't want recognition. Her phone buzzed. Rachel again. He starts his shift at 11 p.m. We could approach him at the warehouse around 10:30, catch him before work? No. Evelyn didn't want to corner him at his job, didn't want to make this about power dynamics. Find out when he's dropping his daughter at school. I'll approach him then, casual, just a conversation. That's borderline stalking. That's showing up to say thank you. Okay, but I'm coming with you. Safety protocol. Evelyn didn't argue. Rachel would insist, and honestly, showing up alone might be more intimidating than showing up with an assistant. At least with Rachel there, it was clearly a professional courtesy rather than something more personal. Though what exactly it was becoming, Evelyn wasn't entirely sure. Mark woke to Sophie bouncing on his bed, her standard morning greeting when she was in a good mood. Dad, Mrs. Chen said we're getting a class pet. Probably a hamster. Can we get a hamster too? Mark groaned, squinting at the clock. 7:15 a.m., which meant he'd gotten about 4 hours of sleep after his shift. Sophie, we've talked about pets. The apartment doesn't allow... But a hamster's really small. It would live in a cage. Please? He sat up, pulling her into a hug that made her giggle and squirm. We'll see. Now go brush your teeth. You've got school in an hour. Sophie scampered off, already chattering about hamster names, and Mark allowed himself one more minute of rest before hauling himself out of bed. His body ached in the specific way that came from lifting boxes for 8 hours, and his ribs were sore from yesterday's exertion. The Heimlich maneuver looked simple in diagrams, but executing it properly required significant force. He'd have bruises. His phone showed 17 missed calls and 43 text messages. Mark ignored all of them, focusing instead on the morning routine, Breakfast for Sophie, packing her lunch, finding her homework that she swore she'd put in her backpack but was actually under the couch. Normal, familiar, the parts of life that mattered. "Dad, why's your phone keep buzzing?" Sophie asked through a mouthful of cereal. "Work stuff," Mark said, which was easier than explaining that strangers on the internet were obsessed with a video of him saving someone's life. "Nothing important." They walked to school together like always, Sophie holding his hand and telling him elaborate stories about her friend's new puppy. Mark listened with half his attention, the rest scanning their surroundings out of habit, checking for traffic, watching for anything unusual, the hypervigilance of a parent who'd learned that danger could come from anywhere. He didn't notice the expensive town car parked down the block, or the two women inside watching them through tinted windows. At the school gates, Sophie hugged him tight. "Love you, Dad. See you after work." "Love you too, sweetheart. Be good." He watched until she disappeared inside, then started the walk back to their apartment. He had 4 hours before he needed to sleep, which meant time to do laundry, buy groceries, and maybe catch up on the household repairs he'd been putting off. "Mr. Reynolds?" The voice made him turn. A woman stood beside the town car he hadn't noticed, dressed too well for this neighborhood, her expression professional but not unfriendly. Beside her stood another woman, and Mark's breath caught as he recognized her from yesterday. The one he'd saved, though she looked different without terror in her eyes. Evelyn Cross stepped forward, and Mark instinctively stepped back, his heart rate spiking. "I'm sorry to approach you like this," Evelyn said quickly, reading his discomfort. "I know this is unexpected. I just wanted to thank you in person for what you did." Mark glanced around, suddenly aware that anyone could be watching, filming, posting. "How did you find me?" "I have resources," Evelyn admitted. "I know that sounds ominous, but I promise my intentions are good. I just wanted to express my gratitude." "You don't need to," Mark said, the same words he'd used in the restaurant. "I'm glad you're okay. That's enough." "It's not enough for me." Evelyn's voice carried quiet intensity. "You saved my life. I can't just send a card and move on." "Why not?" Mark asked, genuinely confused. "That's what people do. Send cards, say thanks, move on with their lives." Evelyn blinked, clearly not expecting the question. Because what you did was extraordinary." "It was the Heimlich maneuver. They teach it in basic first aid. It's not extraordinary, it's just necessary." They stood facing each other on the sidewalk, two people from completely different worlds, neither quite sure how to bridge the gap. Rachel, sensing the conversation stalling, stepped forward. "Mr. Reynolds, would you be willing to have coffee with Miss Cross? Just a conversation, nothing more. 15 minutes of your time." Mark looked at them both. The billionaire CEO who'd nearly died and the efficient assistant who'd tracked him down, and felt the weight of obligation settling on his shoulders. He didn't want this, didn't want attention or gratitude or whatever complicated social debt they thought he'd created. But he also recognized that sometimes you didn't get to choose your responsibilities. Sometimes they chose you. 15 minutes, he agreed, but somewhere quiet, no cameras. Evelyn's expression shifted to something that might have been relief or gratitude or both. "I know just the place." They ended up at a small diner 6 blocks from Sophie's school, the kind of place with vinyl booths and laminated menus that hadn't changed since the 90s. Evelyn had never been inside an establishment like this, and Rachel looked actively uncomfortable as they slid into a corner booth. But Mark seemed to relax slightly once they were seated away from the windows. "Coffee?" the waitress asked, appearing with a pot before anyone answered. Her name tag read Donna, and she had the efficient weariness of someone who'd worked this shift for 20 years. "Please," Mark said, turning over his cup. He knew Donna had brought Sophie here for pancakes on her birthday last year, and the familiarity of the surroundings helped counter the surreal nature of sitting across from one of the wealthiest women in the country. Evelyn and Rachel both nodded, and Donna poured without comment, though her eyes lingered on Evelyn with faint recognition. "Let me know if you need anything else." After she left, silence settled over the table. Rachel busied herself with her phone, clearly trying to give them space while remaining present. Mark added cream to his coffee with steady hands, and Evelyn found herself watching the simple gesture, noting again the calluses, the competence, the lack of self-consciousness. "I meant what I said," Evelyn began, wrapping her hands around her own cup. I wanted to thank you properly. What you did was basic first aid, Mark interrupted gently. Anyone could have done it. But no one else did. Evelyn leaned forward slightly. The restaurant was full of people, educated, successful people, and they all froze. You didn't. Mark shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. They probably didn't know what to do. I learned the Heimlich when my daughter was younger. She has severe asthma, used to have attacks where she couldn't breathe. I took every safety course I could find because I needed to know how to help her. Something in Evelyn's expression shifted, understanding replacing curiosity. Your daughter, Sophie, right? Mark's eyes sharpened, a flash of protective concern crossing his features. How do you know her name? Public records, Rachel said quietly, looking up from her phone. The fundraiser article from a few years ago. We weren't trying to invade your privacy, just trying to understand who you were. Why? Mark asked, his tone not hostile but genuinely confused. I helped someone who needed it. That should be the end of it. Why does it matter who I am? Evelyn set down her coffee cup, studying him with the same intensity she brought to negotiating billion-dollar deals. Because in my world, everyone has an agenda. Everyone wants something, but you saved my life and then walked away from the opportunity to leverage that into anything useful. It's, she paused, searching for the right word, unusual. It's decent, Mark corrected. Or at least it should be. I don't want anything from you, Ms. Cross. I'm not looking for a job or money or connections or whatever people in your world trade in. I just want to go back to my regular life and pretend none of this happened. That's not possible anymore, Rachel said, her tone apologetic but firm. The video has been viewed millions of times. Someone's going to identify you publicly if they haven't already. You're about to become a story whether you like it or not. Mark's jaw tightened. I didn't ask to be a story. No, Evelyn agreed. You asked to be left alone. But I'm afraid that ship has sailed, which is partly why I wanted to find you first, to warn you what's coming and to offer help managing it. Managing it? Mark repeated, something hard entering his voice. You mean PR, controlling the narrative, making me into some kind of character in your company's brand story? No, Evelyn said sharply, stung by the accuracy of his cynicism. I mean protecting your privacy and your daughter's safety. I mean making sure when reporters show up at your work or your home or Sophie's school, you have resources to deal with it. I mean giving you options instead of leaving you to drown in attention you never wanted. Mark stared at her, trying to read whether this was genuine concern or sophisticated manipulation. In his experience, wealthy people didn't help without expecting returns. It was one of the many unwritten rules that separated his world from theirs. What kind of options? He asked carefully. Evelyn glanced at Rachel, who pulled out a tablet and opened a document. We've drafted a statement you could release, brief, respectful, asking for privacy. We can also have our legal team send cease and desist letters to any media outlets that harass you or Sophie. And if you need security for a few days while the initial frenzy dies down— Security? Mark interrupted, the word foreign in his mouth. For what? I'm a warehouse worker, not a celebrity. You saved a billionaire CEO's life, Rachel said bluntly. That makes you interesting to a lot of people with cameras and microphones. Some of them will be respectful, others won't be. Mark thought about Sophie, about her walking to school past reporters or being photographed without permission. The idea made his stomach turn. I can't afford security. You wouldn't have to, Evelyn said. Consider it part of my thank you, along with covering any legal fees or other expenses that come up because of this situation. I don't want your money, Mark said, the words coming out harder than he'd intended. I appreciate the offer, but I don't need charity. It's not charity, Evelyn countered, matching his tone. It's compensation for disrupting your life. I didn't ask you to save me, and you didn't ask for the consequences, but here we are. The least I can do is make sure those consequences don't hurt you or your daughter. They sat in tense silence, the clatter of dishes and low conversation from other diners filling the space between them. Donna appeared with the coffee pot, refilling their cups without being asked, her presence a brief interruption that gave everyone a moment to breathe. After she left, Mark spoke more quietly. Ms. Cross, I understand you're trying to help. I do. But in my experience, when rich people offer help, there are strings attached, expectations, obligations. I've worked hard to build a life where I don't owe anyone anything, where Sophie and I are independent. I'm not eager to complicate that. There are no strings, Evelyn said, and she was surprised to realize she meant it. I'm not trying to buy you or own you or turn you into a prop for my image. I genuinely just want to help mitigate the damage I've caused by being saved in a public place. Mark studied her face, looking for the lie, the angle, the hidden agenda. But Evelyn Cross, whatever else she might be, met his gaze directly, and he saw something there that surprised him. Guilt. She actually felt responsible for what was happening to him. Why does this matter so much to you? He asked. Plenty of people get saved every day. EMTs, firefighters, random strangers doing CPR. The world doesn't stop for them. Because most of those people aren't me, Evelyn said, with a self-awareness that bordered on bitter. Because when it happens to someone famous, it becomes a spectacle. And I hate that you're caught in that spectacle when you deliberately tried to avoid it. Rachel's phone buzzed insistently. She glanced at it, her expression tightening. We have a problem. Someone just posted your name on Reddit. Full name, workplace, general neighborhood. It's already been shared to Twitter. Mark closed his eyes briefly, feeling the last remnants of his privacy evaporating. How long until they have my address? Hours, maybe less, Rachel said grimly. Public records are public. Once they have your full name, the rest is just Googling. Sophie's, Mark said, his mind immediately jumping to worst-case scenarios. I need to call her school, make sure no one— Already done, Rachel interrupted, typing rapidly on her tablet. I'm sending a message to the school administration now, flagging that Sophie Reynolds is not to be released to anyone except you, that media should be turned away from school property, and that any unusual activity should be reported immediately. I'll copy you on everything. Mark looked at her, surprise cutting through his anxiety. You can do that? I can do a lot of things, Rachel said without looking up, including make sure your daughter stays safe while the internet loses its mind over her dad being a decent person. Evelyn watched Mark process this, saw the moment his resistance began to crack under the practical reality of their situation. He didn't want help from them, didn't want to be indebted, but he also wouldn't let pride endanger his daughter. Okay, Mark said finally, the word carrying the weight of a surrender he didn't want to make. What do I need to do? Evelyn felt relief wash over her, though she was careful not to show it. First, we release a joint statement, something brief. I'm grateful, you're humble, we both want privacy. It won't stop the attention completely, but it frames the narrative before someone else does. Then we get you home and assess security needs for the next few days, Rachel continued, her tone shifting to the efficient problem-solving mode she used for crisis management. We'll have someone discreet keep an eye on your building, make sure reporters don't camp out in your lobby, same for Sophie's school. How long does this usually last? Mark asked. The attention, I mean. Depends on what else is happening in the news, Evelyn said honestly. Could be a few days, could be a couple weeks, but it will fade. Everything does eventually. Mark ran a hand through his hair, exhaustion evident in the gesture. I have to work tonight. I can't just take time off because the internet decided I'm interesting. We can talk to your employer, Rachel offered. Explain the situation, arrange for— No, Mark cut her off. I don't want special treatment at work. I show up on time, do my job, and go home. That's the deal. I'm not asking for exceptions because of this. Evelyn recognized the pride in his voice, the same fierce independence that had made him refuse recognition in the restaurant. She understood it in a way she hadn't expected. She'd built her own career refusing to accept limitations or special treatment because of her gender, fighting for every achievement to be purely on merit. Then we'll work around your schedule, she said. But you should know that your employer might get calls from media asking for comments or interviews. You might want to give them a heads up. Mark nodded slowly, accepting this as reasonable. My supervisor, Darius, he already texted me about the video. He thinks it's funny. I'll talk to him before my shift. Good. Evelyn pulled out a business card, wrote her personal cell number on the back, and slid it across the table. If anything happens, reporters showing up, people bothering Sophie, Anything that makes you uncomfortable, call me, day or night. I'll handle it. Mark looked at the card like it might explode. I'm not going to call a billionaire CEO at 3 in the morning because a reporter knocked on my door. You will if they're harassing your daughter, Evelyn said with quiet certainty, and I'll have lawyers on site within an hour. That's not charity, Mr. Reynolds. That's taking responsibility for the situation my rescue created. They sat there for another moment, the coffee growing cold between them, before Mark finally picked up the card and put it in his wallet. It felt like accepting more than contact information. It felt like acknowledging that his life had changed in ways he couldn't control, and that maybe, just maybe, he needed help dealing with it. I should get going, he said, checking his phone. I need to sleep before work, and I want to be there when Sophie gets home from school. Of course. Evelyn stood when he did, Rachel following suit. I'll have that statement drafted and sent to you within the hour. You can approve or request changes before we release it. Mark nodded, then hesitated, something else clearly on his mind. Ms. Cross, can I ask you something? Anything. Why were you eating alone? The question came out awkward, like he wasn't sure he had the right to ask. In the restaurant. Someone like you, I figured you'd always have people around. Evelyn smiled slightly, surprised by the question and by how much she wanted to answer honestly. Sometimes people around you is the loneliest thing in the world. I was alone because it was the only way to actually have peace. Mark nodded like he understood, though his solitude came from different circumstances. Not choice, but necessity. Not escape, but reality. Makes sense. Thanks for the coffee. Thank you, Evelyn said, for giving me the chance to say thank you in person. He almost smiled at that, the corners of his mouth quirking up briefly before he caught himself. Then he was heading toward the door, shoulders slightly hunched like he was bracing against wind, and Evelyn watched him go with the strange feeling that she'd just met someone who would prove important in ways she couldn't yet predict. Rachel slid back into the booth, already pulling up documents on her tablet. He's going to be eaten alive by the media if we don't move fast. I'll have the statement ready in 30 minutes, coordinate with his employer, and get security assigned to discreet surveillance by this afternoon. Good. Evelyn sat down again, staring at the coffee cup Mark had left behind. What did you think of him? Rachel looked up, surprised by the question. Honestly? Exactly what he appears to be. A good man in a difficult situation who doesn't want complications. Which means we need to make this as uncomplicated as possible. Agreed. But even as Evelyn said it, she knew complicated was already inevitable. Not because of PR or media or public spectacle, but because she couldn't stop thinking about the way Mark had looked at his daughter's school, the protective concern in his eyes, the way he'd refused help until it threatened Sophie's safety, then accepted it without hesitation. He was a man who'd built his entire life around someone else's needs, who measured success not in dollars or achievements, but in whether his daughter was happy and safe. It was so foreign to Evelyn's experience, so completely opposite to every value she'd internalized in building her empire, that she found herself fascinated by it. Rachel was typing rapidly, her fingers flying across the tablet. Statement Draft 1. I am deeply grateful to Mr. Mark Reynolds for his quick action and clear thinking in a moment of crisis. His calm competence undoubtedly saved my life. I ask that the media respect his privacy and that of his family as we both move forward from this incident. Thank you. Too formal, Evelyn said. And don't name him directly. Let people know we're aware of his identity without confirming it officially. Keep the mystery alive a little longer. Give him a few more hours before the flood. Rachel nodded, making adjustments. Draft 2. I am profoundly grateful to the person who came to my aid 2 nights ago. In a room full of people, one individual acted with remarkable calm and competence, and I owe my life to their quick thinking. While I know there is public curiosity about this person's identity, I ask that we all respect their clear desire for privacy. True heroism doesn't seek recognition. Thank you. Better, Evelyn approved. Send it to Mark for approval. Make sure he's comfortable with it before we release anything. Her phone rang, her mother calling for the second time in 12 hours, which meant she'd been following the story. I met him, Evelyn said by way of greeting. The man who saved you? Her mother's voice carried both curiosity and concern. And? And he's exactly what he appears to be. No angle, no agenda, just a father trying to live quietly. Those are the dangerous ones, her mother said, though her tone was gentle. The ones without agendas are the hardest to predict or control. I'm not trying to control him, Evelyn protested. I'm trying to help him. Same thing in your world. You've spent 20 years managing people and outcomes. Be careful you don't mistake help for manipulation, even with good intentions. Evelyn wanted to argue, but the warning hit too close to something she'd been feeling herself. I'm being careful. Good. Because from what I'm reading, this man has a lot to lose and very little safety net. Don't add to his burdens while trying to ease your own conscience. After they hung up, Evelyn sat in the diner booth, watching the normal rhythms of working-class life play out around her. People eating quick meals between shifts, counting change for tips, having conversations about bills and children and the small victories and defeats of ordinary existence. This was Mark's world, and she was a visitor in it, armed with resources and influence that could either help or harm depending on how carefully she wielded them. We should go, Rachel said gently. You have calls scheduled this afternoon, and I need to coordinate security logistics. Evelyn stood, leaving cash on the table for Donna that amounted to nearly $100 for 3 cups of coffee. It was simultaneously too much and meaningless. The cost of someone's groceries for a week represented less than she made in the time it took to drink the coffee. As they walked to the car, Evelyn's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Mark's message was characteristically brief. Statement looks good. You can release it. Thanks for the help. She texted back, remember, call if you need anything. I mean it. No response came, and Evelyn didn't expect one. Mark Reynolds had accepted help because his daughter's safety required it, but he clearly intended to maintain as much distance as possible otherwise. He'd been pulled into her orbit by circumstance, not choice, and would escape it the moment circumstances allowed. The reasonable thing would be to let him, to provide the promised resources, manage the media situation, and then step back and let him return to his normal life. Their paths had crossed in a moment of crisis. She'd expressed her gratitude, and now they could both move on. But Evelyn found herself reluctant to accept that reasonable conclusion. Not because she wanted to control Mark or own his gratitude, but because she genuinely wanted to understand him. In a world where everyone performed calculated versions of themselves, he was genuinely uncalculating. In a culture that worshipped success, he measured worth by entirely different metrics. He was a mystery that had nothing to do with heroics and everything to do with values she'd spent 20 years telling herself were naive or unsustainable in the real world. Maybe her mother was right. Maybe the ones without agendas were the most dangerous. Not to others, but to the carefully constructed certainties that let you function in a ruthless world without questioning the cost. Evelyn? Rachel's voice broke through her thoughts. Are you all right? Fine, Evelyn said automatically. Then, more honestly, I'm not sure. Ask me again in a few days. Okay. Mark made it home by noon, his mind churning with everything that had happened in the last hour. He'd sat across from Evelyn Cross in a diner booth and had a conversation that felt both surreal and strangely normal. She wasn't what he'd expected, less imperious, more uncertain, clearly out of her element in his world, just as much as he'd been out of his in hers. His apartment felt smaller after meeting her, the contrast between her resources and his limitations suddenly stark in ways it hadn't been before. The carpet was worn, the furniture secondhand, the walls thin enough that he could hear his neighbor's television through the plaster. But it was clean and safe and affordable, and that was all that mattered. He tried to sleep but couldn't, his mind too active with worry about what the next few days would bring. Finally, he gave up and did what he always did when anxious, cleaned, dishes, laundry, vacuuming, scrubbing the bathroom until it gleamed. Physical activity to quiet mental noise. His phone rang at 2 p.m. Darius. Man, you're famous, his supervisor said without preamble. I've had 3 reporters call the warehouse asking about you. Told them we don't comment on employees, but they're persistent. Sorry, Mark said, guilt settling in his chest. I didn't mean to bring this to work. You kidding? This is the most exciting thing that's happened here in years. Jimmy in loading wants your autograph. Darius paused. Seriously, though, you okay? This can't be fun for you. It's not, Mark admitted. But I'm handling it. I'll be there tonight. On time. Ready to work. Take the night off if you need to. We can cover your shift. I need to work, Mark said firmly. I need normal. All right, but if reporters show up here bothering you, let me know. I'll have security escort them out. After hanging up, Mark felt marginally better. Work was still normal. Darius still treated him the same. The world hadn't completely tilted off its axis. He picked Sophie up from school at 3:30, watching carefully for any sign of unusual attention. But the afternoon pickup was standard chaos, parents and kids and teachers managing the daily transition from school day to home life. How was your day? He asked as Sophie climbed into their used Honda. Good. We learned about fractions and I got a gold star on my spelling test and Mrs. Chen said maybe next week we can vote on the class pet. Sophie buckled herself in, chattering happily about hamsters versus guinea pigs. Mark listened, relief washing over him. Her day had been completely normal. No reporters, no unusual questions, no invasion of her childhood by his sudden notoriety. They stopped at the grocery store on the way home, and Mark felt hyper-aware of every glance in their direction, every person who might recognize him from the viral video. But no one approached, no cameras appeared, and they made it home with milk and bread and Sophie's favorite cereal without incident. Maybe it wouldn't be as bad as Rachel predicted. Maybe the internet's attention span was short enough that this would all blow over quickly and they could return to their regular lives. He was making dinner, spaghetti, Sophie's favorite, when someone knocked on their apartment door. Mark tensed immediately, telling Sophie to stay in the kitchen while he checked the peephole. A man stood in the hallway with a camera and press credentials hanging around his neck. Mark's stomach sank. So it was starting. He opened the door just wide enough to speak through the gap. Can I help you? Mark Reynolds, I'm Jason Chen with Channel 7 News. I was hoping to ask you a few questions about the incident at Luminaire Restaurant. No comment, Mark said firmly. I'd appreciate it if you'd leave. Just a few questions. The public wants to know about the hero who, I'm not a hero, and I'm not interested in talking to the press. Please leave, or I'll call building security. The reporter's expression shifted, recognizing he wasn't going to get cooperation. The story's going to run with or without your input. Wouldn't you rather have your perspective included? My perspective is that I want privacy. That should be clear enough. Mark closed the door, locked it, and stood there for a moment, his heart pounding. Sophie appeared in the kitchen doorway. Who was that? Wrong apartment, Mark lied, not wanting to scare her. Come on, dinner's almost ready. But as they ate spaghetti and Sophie told him about her friend's puppy, Mark's phone kept buzzing with unknown numbers. Reporters, he assumed, or people who'd found his contact information online. He silenced it, but the anxiety remained. This was only the beginning. At 9 p.m., he got Sophie ready for bed, reading her favorite story twice because she asked, and because he needed the comfort of routine as much as she did. Dad? Sophie said sleepily as he tucked her in. Are you okay? You seem worried. Just thinking about work stuff, Mark said, smoothing her dark curls. Nothing for you to worry about. Sweet dreams, sweetheart. Love you. Love you too. He left her door cracked and went to get ready for his shift, pulling on his work clothes and packing his lunch with mechanical efficiency. Lisa, his neighbor, would come sit in his apartment while Sophie slept, same as she did every night he worked. The arrangement had been in place for 2 years, and Lisa treated Sophie like her own granddaughter. She arrived at 10:15, letting herself in with her spare key. Big news about you helping that rich lady. Saw it on Facebook. Yeah, Mark said, not wanting to elaborate. There might be reporters hanging around. Don't answer the door for anyone, and if anyone bothers you, call me immediately. Lisa's eyes widened. Reporters? Coming here? Maybe. Probably. I don't know. Mark ran a hand through his hair, frustration bleeding through. Just be careful, okay? We'll be fine, Lisa assured him, though she looked concerned. Sophie's already asleep anyway. Go on to work. Don't be late because of this nonsense. Mark left reluctantly, hyper-aware of the car parked across the street with someone sitting inside. Security, he assumed, the discreet surveillance Evelyn's people had promised. It should have been comforting, but instead it just emphasized how much his life had changed in 48 hours. The warehouse was a 20-minute bus ride away, and Mark used the time to try to clear his head. This would pass. The attention would fade. He just had to keep his head down and wait it out. But when he arrived at Riverside Logistics, he found Darius waiting by the employee entrance with an uncomfortable expression. "We need to talk before you clock in," his supervisor said. Mark's stomach dropped. "Am I being let go?" "What? No." Darius looked genuinely shocked. "Nothing like that, but corporate called. They want to do a press release about having a hero on staff, maybe get some photos for the website. Good publicity for the company," they said. "I don't want to do that," Mark said immediately. "I told them you probably wouldn't, but they're pretty insistent. Said it would be good for morale, show that Riverside Logistics employs quality people." Darius shrugged apologetically. "I can push back, but you know how corporate is." Mark felt trapped, the walls of his carefully constructed normal life closing in from all directions. He couldn't control the media, couldn't stop the internet, and now even his employer wanted to capitalize on something he'd deliberately tried to avoid. "Tell them I'll think about it," he said finally, needing time to figure out his options. "Fair enough. In the meantime, you're on usual assignment, loading dock, inventory processing. Jimmy's got the manifest." Mark clocked in and headed to the loading dock, grateful for the physical labor that would occupy his hands and hopefully quiet his mind. The warehouse was busy with the usual night shift rhythm, forklifts beeping, pallets clattering, the organized chaos of logistics in motion. Jimmy greeted him with a grin. "Yo, hero, heard you saved some billionaire lady. That's wild, man." "Just did what anyone would do," Mark said, grabbing his scanner and work gloves. "Nah, most people would have frozen up. You got skills." Jimmy clapped him on the shoulder. "Drinks on me next time we hit Charlie's." Mark managed a smile, appreciating that Jimmy's teasing was good-natured rather than intrusive. This he could handle. Coworkers making jokes, normal workplace ribbing. It was the reporters and corporate PR and the feeling of being watched that made his skin crawl. He lost himself in the work, scanning boxes and moving inventory with the efficiency that came from 2 years on this shift. Physical labor was honest in a way nothing else was. You either moved the boxes or you didn't, met your quota or you didn't, earned your paycheck or you didn't. No ambiguity, no hidden agendas, just straightforward cause and effect. Around 2 a.m., during his break, Mark checked his phone and found a text from an unknown number. "Mr. Reynolds, this is Rachel Hoffman, Miss Cross's assistant. We've had to issue 2 cease and desist letters to reporters who showed up at your building. Security will remain in place until the attention dies down. Let us know if you need anything else." Mark stared at the message, feeling the weight of obligation pressing down on him. He hadn't asked for this help, but he also couldn't deny he needed it. The reporters would have camped in his lobby, would have harassed Lisa, and potentially scared Sophie. Evelyn's resources were protecting them. He typed back, "Thank you. Appreciate it." The response came quickly. "Ms. Cross wanted me to let you know that the story is already fading from trending. Should be mostly done by end of week. Hang in there." Mark pocketed his phone and returned to work, telling himself that Evelyn's assistant was right. 1 more week of craziness, then back to normal. He could handle 1 week. But even as he thought it, part of him wondered if normal was something he could ever fully return to, or if saving Evelyn Cross's life had permanently altered the trajectory of his quiet existence in ways he couldn't yet understand. The rest of his shift passed without incident, familiar and grounding, and when he clocked out at 7 a.m., the sun was rising over the warehouse district, painting everything in shades of gold and pink. Mark stood in the parking lot for a moment, breathing in the cool morning air, letting the beauty of the ordinary moment settle into his bones. This was real. Sophie sleeping safely in their apartment, Lisa probably dozing on their couch, the bus that would take him home arriving in exactly 7 minutes. This was his life, and it mattered more than any viral video or billionaire's gratitude. The bus arrived on schedule, and Mark climbed aboard, already thinking about breakfast with Sophie and whether they had time for pancakes before school. Normal thoughts, normal rhythms. He would protect this normalcy with everything he had, no matter what storm the rest of the world tried to blow through his life. Sophie was eating pancakes when Mark got home, Lisa having already prepared breakfast with the easy competence of someone who'd been helping with morning routines for years. "Your dad's here," Lisa said, standing and gathering her things. "She's been good as gold, like always." "Thanks, Lisa, really." Mark pulled out his wallet, but she waved him off like she always did. You know I don't take money for watching this angel. You'd do the same for me. She paused at the door, lowering her voice. Those security people are still out there. One of them asked if I was okay when I came down this morning. Very polite, but it's strange having them around. Should be done soon, Mark said, hoping it was true. The attention's supposed to die down. After Lisa left, Mark joined Sophie at their small kitchen table, stealing a piece of her pancake and making her giggle. This was the good part of his life, the part worth protecting. The simple joy of breakfast with his daughter before school, her chatter about fractions and class pets, the syrup on her chin that she didn't notice until he pointed it out. Dad, can we go to the park after school? Sophie asked, swinging her legs under the table. Please, it's supposed to be really nice out. Mark hesitated. The park meant public space, meant potential recognition, meant more chances for cameras and questions. But it also meant normal childhood activities, meant not letting fear control their lives, meant giving Sophie the ordinary happiness she deserved. Sure, he said. Park after school. Sophie beamed, and Mark felt the decision settle into something right despite the risks. He wouldn't let viral videos and media attention steal these moments from her. They walked to school together, Mark scanning their surroundings with heightened awareness. The security car followed at a discreet distance, and Mark spotted at least one person with a camera on the opposite corner who perked up when they appeared. But no one approached, no one called out questions, and Sophie remained blissfully unaware of the attention. At the school gates, she hugged him tight. See you later, Dad. Don't forget the park. I won't forget. Love you, sweetheart. He watched until she disappeared inside, then turned to head home, deliberately not looking at the person with the camera. If he ignored them, maybe they'd get bored and leave. His phone rang. Evelyn Cross. Mark almost didn't answer, but curiosity won over caution. Hello? Mr. Reynolds, I hope I'm not calling too early. Evelyn's voice was professional but less formal than in the diner. I wanted to check in, see how you're managing. We're fine, Mark said automatically, still walking. Security's been helpful, no major problems. Good. Rachel mentioned your employer wants to do a press release. I wanted to offer our PR team to help manage that if you'd like. Make sure it's on your terms, not theirs. Mark stopped walking, processing the offer. Why would you do that? You've already helped more than necessary. Because I know what it's like when corporate interests try to use you for their narrative, Evelyn said, her tone carrying unexpected bitterness. I've spent 20 years fighting to control my own story. I can at least help you do the same. Mark stood on the sidewalk, early morning foot traffic flowing around him, considering the offer. Part of him wanted to refuse on principle. Accepting more help meant more obligation, more entanglement with someone whose world operated by rules he didn't understand. But another part recognized that Evelyn had resources and experience he lacked, and that Sophie's well-being mattered more than his pride. What would your PR team do exactly? He asked. Review whatever your employer wants to release, negotiate changes that protect your privacy, make sure they're not promising interviews or appearances you haven't agreed to. Basically, make sure they get their good publicity without compromising your life. It was a reasonable offer, maybe even necessary. Mark didn't know enough about media and corporate PR to navigate it alone, and the wrong statement could make things worse instead of better. Okay, he said. That would be helpful. Thank you. I'll have Rachel coordinate with you. She'll need your employer's contact information and any drafts they've shared. Evelyn paused. How's Sophie handling all this? The question surprised Mark. Not what he'd expected from a billionaire CEO making a business-efficient courtesy call. She doesn't really know about it yet. I'm trying to keep her normal life normal for as long as possible. That's good parenting, Evelyn said, and something in her voice suggested she meant it. My mother tried to do the same when my father left, and the divorce got ugly. Didn't always work, but I appreciated the effort. Mark didn't know what to say to that. This glimpse of Evelyn Cross as a person with difficult family history rather than just a powerful executive. The silence stretched for a moment before Evelyn spoke again. I should let you go. I'm sure you need rest after working all night, but Mr. Reynolds, Mark, if I may, please don't hesitate to call if things get overwhelming. I meant what I said about taking responsibility for this situation. I know you did, Mark said, and realized he believed it. Whatever else Evelyn Cross might be, she was genuinely trying to help. I appreciate it. After hanging up, Mark continued home, thinking about the conversation. Evelyn had shared something personal, had connected over protective parenting rather than just offering resources. It made her more human, more complicated than the image he'd built in his head. Back at the apartment, he tried to sleep but kept thinking about the park, about whether taking Sophie there was wise or reckless. Finally, he gave up on rest and spent the afternoon doing laundry and researching public relations strategies on his phone, trying to educate himself about the landscape he'd been forced into. Rachel called at 2 p.m. with characteristic efficiency. I've been in touch with Riverside Logistics Communications Department. They've drafted a statement that's mostly fine, but they want to include a photo of you in your work uniform. I pushed back, suggested stock warehouse imagery instead. They're considering it. Thank you, Mark said. I really don't want my face plastered all over their website. Understandable. I'll keep negotiating. In the meantime, the media attention is definitely dropping off. Only got one new inquiry today, compared to dozens yesterday. Should be clear by early next week. Mark felt some tension ease from his shoulders. One more week. He could handle one more week. He picked Sophie up from school at 3:30, and they walked to the neighborhood park, a small green space with worn playground equipment and patchy grass. Sophie ran ahead to the swings, and Mark followed at a slower pace, hyper-aware of the other parents, the joggers, anyone who might recognize him. But no one paid them special attention. Parents focused on their own children, joggers kept jogging, and Mark began to relax as Sophie played with the unselfconscious joy of a child who didn't know her father was briefly internet famous. "Push me higher, Dad," Sophie called from the swings, and Mark obliged, pushing her until she squealed with delight, her laughter bright in the afternoon air. This was why everything else mattered so little. This moment, Sophie happy and safe, the simple pleasure of an ordinary park on an ordinary afternoon, was worth more than recognition or gratitude or any complexity the outside world wanted to impose on his life. A woman approached the swings with a girl about Sophie's age. "Sophie, hi! Emma!" Sophie jumped off the swing mid-arc, landing with practiced ease, and ran to hug her classmate. The two girls immediately launched into conversation about the potential class pet. Emma's mother smiled at Mark. "You're Sophie's dad? I'm Jennifer, Emma's mom. The girls talk about each other constantly." "Mark," he said, shaking her offered hand. "Nice to meet you. Would Sophie like to come over for a play date sometime? Emma would love it." Mark felt unexpected warmth at the normalcy of the invitation. Just two parents arranging time for their kids to play together. Nothing more complicated than that. That would be great. Sophie would love it too. They exchanged numbers, made tentative plans for the weekend, and Mark felt something in his chest loosen. This was still possible. Normal social connections, ordinary friendships, a regular life for Sophie despite the media circus. The girls played together until the sun started setting, and Mark and Jennifer made small talk about schools and children and the mundane details of parenting. Not once did she mention viral videos or rescued CEOs, and Mark began to hope she simply hadn't seen the news or made the connection. Walking home, Sophie chatted about Emma and the playdate, and Mark felt cautiously optimistic that maybe the worst was over. The attention was fading, work was managing the PR situation with Rachel's help, and Sophie's world remained untouched by the chaos that had briefly threatened it. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number with a photo attached. Mark opened it and felt his stomach drop. The image showed him and Sophie at the park, clearly taken from a distance with a zoom lens. The caption read, "Hero Dad's heartwarming afternoon with daughter, exclusive photos." Mark stopped walking, his heart pounding. Someone had followed them to the park, had photographed Sophie without permission, was preparing to publish images of his 8-year-old daughter to capitalize on a story she had nothing to do with. "Dad? What's wrong?" Sophie asked, noticing his frozen expression. "Nothing, sweetheart. Just checking something." Mark forced his voice to stay calm while fury and fear warred in his chest. "Let's get home." Once Sophie was safely inside the apartment, Mark called the number Evelyn had given him. She answered on the second ring. "They photographed my daughter," he said without preamble, his voice shaking with suppressed anger. At the park, without my permission. They're planning to publish the photos. Who sent you this? Evelyn's voice went sharp and focused. Our lawyers will send a cease and desist immediately, threaten lawsuit if they publish, and make it clear that pursuing your daughter will cost them more than any story is worth. Rachel's voice came through the background. Got the forwarded message. Running the number now should have an outlet identified within minutes. Mark sank onto his couch, the adrenaline crash leaving him hollow. I thought this was almost over. Rachel said the attention was dying down. It is, Evelyn said, her voice gentler now. This is the last gasp, someone trying to squeeze one more story out of the situation. We stop them hard, make an example, and everyone else backs off. I promise you, Mark, we will protect Sophie. Something about the way she said his daughter's name, with genuine care rather than just professional concern, made Mark's throat tight. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Thank me when this is resolved. Evelyn's voice shifted back to command mode. Rachel, what do we have? Number traces to a freelance photographer who sells to gossip sites, Rachel reported. No major outlet backing, just fishing for a payday. That actually makes this easier. No corporate legal department to negotiate with. Send the cease and desist, Evelyn ordered. Maximum aggression. Include potential damages, privacy violations, harassment of a minor. Make it clear that publishing will result in immediate lawsuit and criminal complaint. On it. Mark listened to them work with the efficient coordination of people who'd handled crises together for years. Within 10 minutes, Rachel had drafted and sent legal threats to both the photographer and 3 gossip sites known to buy this kind of content. Within 20 minutes, Mark's phone buzzed with a new message from the same number. Apologies for any concern. Photos will not be published. Have a good evening. Ma, the relief was so intense, Mark actually laughed, a slightly hysterical sound that surprised him. They backed down. Of course they did, Evelyn said matter-of-factly. They're vultures looking for easy prey. Show teeth and they scatter. Are you okay? Yeah, I've never had to deal with anything like this before. People following my kid, threatening to publish her photo for clicks and ad revenue. You shouldn't have to deal with it at all, Evelyn said, anger creeping into her voice. It's invasive and exploitative, and I'm sorry my rescue put you in this position. Not your fault you choked on fish, Mark said, feeling steadier now that the immediate threat was resolved. Evelyn laughed, a genuine sound of surprise. True, though I'm rethinking my seafood choices for the foreseeable future. They talked for a few more minutes, Evelyn confirming that security would be enhanced around Sophie's school and their apartment for the rest of the week, just to make sure no one else got ideas about photographing them. By the time they hung up, Mark felt the crisis had passed, but the conversation had shifted something in his perception of Evelyn Cross. She wasn't just providing resources out of obligation or guilt. She was genuinely angry on Sophie's behalf, had moved immediately to protect a child she'd never met, had weaponized her wealth and power for something that mattered rather than just business advantage. Sophie appeared from her room where she'd been drawing. Is everything okay, Dad? You seemed upset. Everything's fine now, Mark assured her, pulling her into a hug. Just some adult stuff that's all sorted out. You hungry for dinner? Can we have mac and cheese? Absolutely. They made dinner together, Sophie standing on a chair to help stir the pot, and Mark felt the normalcy settling back over their lives like a protective blanket. The threat had been real but brief, handled by people with resources he didn't have, leaving him free to focus on what actually mattered, keeping Sophie safe and happy. Later that night, after Sophie was asleep and Mark was getting ready for his warehouse shift, he found himself thinking about Evelyn's immediate response to the photographer. She hadn't hesitated, hadn't asked if he was sure or if it was really necessary. She'd simply moved to eliminate the threat with decisive force. It was the same certainty he'd felt in the restaurant when he'd performed the Heimlich, recognizing a problem and acting to solve it without wasted time on doubt or debate. They were very different people from very different worlds, but in that particular way, they understood each other. Mark headed to work feeling more settled than he had in days. The media attention was fading, the legal threats had scared off the vultures, and Sophie remained safely insulated from the chaos. By next week, this would all be a strange memory, and they could return to their regular lives. The warehouse was busy when he arrived, the usual night shift rhythm already in full swing. Darius met him at the loading dock with good news. Corporate backed off the press release. Well, they're doing one, but it's generic. We're proud to employ people who step up in crisis situations kind of thing. No photos, no naming you specifically, just vague corporate rah-rah. Darius grinned. I may have mentioned that you had billionaire lawyers on speed dial. That cooled their enthusiasm pretty quick. Mark felt another wave of relief. Thanks for running interference. No problem. Though between you and me, I still think we should get t-shirts made. Riverside Logistics, home of heroes. Darius laughed at Mark's expression. Kidding, mostly. Come on, we got 3 trucks to unload before midnight. Work provided its usual comfort. Physical, straightforward, demanding enough to occupy his body without requiring much mental energy. Mark fell into the rhythm of scanning, lifting, moving, stacking, his muscles working while his mind processed everything that had happened since yesterday. The photographer trying to exploit Sophie had terrified him, but it had also clarified something important. He couldn't handle this alone. The world Evelyn inhabited operated by rules he didn't understand, and without her intervention, that photographer might have published those photos, might have exposed Sophie to attention she didn't deserve and couldn't consent to. He'd spent years being fiercely independent, refusing help because accepting it meant obligation and complication. But maybe some complications were worth it if they meant protecting what mattered most. Around 3 a.m., during his break, Mark pulled out his phone and typed a message to Evelyn. Thank you for today. For protecting Sophie. I know I've been resistant to help, but I'm grateful for it, truly. The response came surprisingly quickly for 3 a.m. You're welcome. Get some rest when you can. The worst is over. Mark pocketed his phone and went back to work, feeling like something had shifted. Not just in the external situation, the media dying down, the threats neutralized, but in his own willingness to accept that sometimes independence meant knowing when to let others help. The rest of his shift passed without incident, and when Mark clocked out at 7 a.m., the morning sun was painting the sky in shades of orange and gold again. He stood in the parking lot for a moment, breathing in the cool air, letting the quiet beauty of the ordinary moment wash over him. In a few hours, he'd pick Sophie up from school. This weekend, they'd go to Emma's house for the play date. Next week, everything would be back to normal. The viral video would fade into internet history, replaced by whatever new drama caught the public's attention, and Mark Reynolds would return to blessed anonymity. But he wouldn't forget this week. Wouldn't forget the kindness of a billionaire who'd taken his concerns seriously and used her power to protect his daughter. Wouldn't forget that sometimes help came from unexpected places, and accepting it didn't make you weak. It made you smart enough to recognize when you needed it. Evelyn sat in her office at 3 a.m., unable to sleep despite exhaustion, going through emails when Mark's message arrived. The simple gratitude in his words affected her more than elaborate thank yous from business partners or glowing reviews from clients. He'd been genuinely scared for his daughter, and Evelyn had been able to help in a way that mattered. Not with money or connections or networking opportunities, but with immediate action to protect a child from exploitation. It was possibly the most straightforward good she'd done with her resources in years. Rachel appeared in the doorway, looking as tired as Evelyn felt. You should be home sleeping. So should you, Evelyn countered. Fair point. Rachel sat down across from the desk. The photographer situation is completely resolved. I've also put out quiet word through our legal network that Mark Reynolds and his daughter are off limits. Anyone who tries to harass them will face immediate legal action from us. Should keep the vultures away permanently. Good. Evelyn closed her laptop, accepting that she wasn't going to accomplish anything useful tonight. We did the right thing today. We did, Rachel agreed. Though I have to say you're more invested in this than I expected. Most people would have sent a thank you gift and moved on. Evelyn considered the observation, trying to articulate something she didn't fully understand herself. He saved my life and wanted nothing in return. That's rare, maybe unprecedented in my experience. I feel like I owe him more than just keeping photographers away from his kid. What more is there? You can't force gratitude on someone who doesn't want it. I know, but I can make sure his kindness doesn't cost him anything. That feels like the bare minimum. Rachel studied her boss with the knowing expression of someone who'd worked together for years. You like him? I respect him, Evelyn corrected. There's a difference. Is there? Rachel stood, gathering her things. You never stay up until 3 a.m. worrying about people you just respect. But that's your business, not mine. I'm going home to sleep, and I strongly suggest you do the same. After Rachel left, Evelyn sat in her office a while longer, thinking about Mark's message and Rachel's observation. She did like Mark Reynolds, though not in any romantic sense. Their lives were too different, their values too divergent in some ways. But she admired the way he'd built his life around his daughter's needs, the quiet dignity of his independence, his absolute refusal to perform heroism for an audience. In a world where everyone wanted something from her, Mark wanted nothing. In an industry where image trumped substance, he prioritized substance so completely that image didn't even register. It was refreshing in a way Evelyn hadn't fully appreciated until now. Her phone buzzed. A text from her mother. Saw the news about the photographer. Well handled. Call me tomorrow? Evelyn smiled. Her mother always knew when she'd been working late, always checked in at exactly the right moments. She typed back, "Will do. Love you." Finally, she gathered her things and headed home, the city quiet in the pre-dawn hours. Her apartment felt less empty than usual when she arrived, though she couldn't quite explain why. Maybe just the satisfaction of having helped someone who genuinely needed it. Maybe the strange connection she felt to Mark Reynolds, this man who'd pulled her back from death and then tried to disappear. Whatever it was, Evelyn fell asleep thinking not about quarterly earnings or product launches or the dozen crises that usually occupied her mind, but about a warehouse worker and his daughter, safe in their modest apartment because she'd been able to use her power for something that actually mattered. It was, she realized, as sleep finally claimed her, the first time in years she'd gone to bed feeling like she'd done something unambiguously good with no mixed motives or calculated outcomes. Just help, offered and accepted, simple and clean. In her world, that was revolutionary. By Friday, the media attention had died to almost nothing. A celebrity scandal broke on Wednesday, dominating news cycles and social media, and the story of the mystery hero faded into the background as the internet's fleeting attention moved on to fresh drama. Mark's life returned to its regular rhythms with surprising speed. Work, Sophie, sleep, repeat. The security detail withdrew quietly once it became clear no one was following them anymore. Corporate issued their vague statement about employing quality people and then forgot about the whole thing. Sophie had her playdate with Emma on Saturday, and Mark spent 3 hours at Jennifer's house making small talk with another parent while the girls played. It was beautifully, wonderfully normal. Jennifer never mentioned the rescue or viral videos, and Mark began to believe she either hadn't seen them or had the courtesy not to bring them up. Sunday morning, Mark woke to find an envelope that had been slipped under his apartment door. Inside was a handwritten note on expensive stationery. Mark, I wanted to thank you one more time, privately, now that the circus has died down. What you did for me mattered more than you probably realize. If you ever need anything, and I mean anything, please don't hesitate to reach out. I know you value your independence, and I respect that. But sometimes life throws curveballs none of us can handle alone. When that happens for you, I hope you'll remember that you have someone in your corner. With sincere gratitude, Evelyn. Below her signature was a phone number. Her personal cell, Mark assumed, not the business line. He stood in his small kitchen, reading the note twice, feeling the weight of the offer. Evelyn Cross, billionaire CEO, telling him he could call for anything. It was surreal and touching and slightly overwhelming. Sophie wandered out of her room, still in her pajamas. What's that? Just a thank you note, Mark said, tucking it back into the envelope. From the lady I helped last week. Oh, can we have pancakes again? Absolutely. As they made breakfast together, Sophie chattering about school and Emma and whether they should get a hamster if Mrs. Chen allowed it, Mark thought about Evelyn's note. She'd kept her word about everything, protecting Sophie, managing the PR, making the chaos as brief and painless as possible. And now she was offering ongoing support with no strings attached. Part of him still resisted accepting that such help could be genuine, but a larger part recognized that Evelyn had proven herself through actions, not words. When Sophie had been threatened, Evelyn had moved immediately to protect her. When Mark had needed legal help, she'd provided it without hesitation. When he'd asked for privacy, she'd enforced it. Maybe some people really did help without expecting returns. Maybe the world wasn't quite as transactional as his experience had taught him to believe. That evening, after Sophie was asleep, Mark pulled out the note and read it one more time. Then he saved Evelyn's number in his phone, not because he intended to use it, but because knowing it was there felt like a safety net he hadn't realized he needed. Life returned to normal, and the story of the invisible hero faded into internet history, replaced by newer dramas and fresher content. Mark Reynolds went back to being anonymous, exactly as he'd wanted. But something had changed, even if he couldn't quite articulate what. Some understanding that help and independence weren't opposites, that accepting support didn't make you weak, that connections between very different people could form in unexpected moments and matter in ways that transcended circumstance. He'd saved a stranger's life and gained something he hadn't known he was missing, the knowledge that he didn't have to face everything alone, that his fierce independence could coexist with accepting help when it truly mattered. It was a small shift, quiet and internal, the kind of change that wouldn't make headlines or trend on social media. But for Mark Reynolds, it was profound. And in her penthouse across the city, Evelyn Cross went to sleep that Sunday night feeling lighter than she had in years, knowing that for once she'd helped someone without complication or calculation, and that the man she'd helped was safe and well and living the quiet life he'd fought so hard to protect. Sometimes, she thought before sleep claimed her, the best stories were the ones that ended simply, without drama or spectacle, with everyone returning to their regular lives carrying small changes that mattered only to them. 3 months passed with the comfortable predictability Mark had always valued. Winter settled over the city, bringing early darkness and the particular cold that seeped through old apartment windows no matter how much weather stripping you applied. Sophie started a unit on multiplication at school, made plans for her 9th birthday party, and stopped asking about class pets after Mrs. Chen's hamster escaped and was never found. Mark's life returned to its familiar patterns so completely that the incident at Luminaire began to feel like something that had happened to someone else. He worked his shifts, attended Sophie's school events, paid bills, and accumulated the small victories and defeats that made up an ordinary existence. Evelyn's note remained in his nightstand drawer, the phone number saved but never called, a safety net he was grateful not to need. Then Sophie got sick. It started as a persistent cough that Mark initially dismissed as a winter cold. But when it didn't improve after a week, when Sophie started wheezing during the night and her inhaler provided less relief than it should, Mark took her to the pediatrician with growing concern. Dr. Morrison examined Sophie thoroughly, listened to her breathing, asked questions about symptom progression, and then referred them to a pulmonologist with an urgency that made Mark's stomach clench. Her asthma is significantly worse than when I last saw her, Dr. Morrison said carefully, her professional calm not quite masking concern. I want a specialist to evaluate whether we need to adjust her treatment plan. The referral I'm writing is for Dr. Sarah Chen at Children's Respiratory Center. She's excellent, and I'll mark this as priority. Mark nodded, taking the referral with hands that wanted to shake. Sophie had been stable for 3 years, her asthma well controlled with standard medication. This sudden deterioration felt wrong, felt dangerous in ways he couldn't articulate but deeply feared. "How soon can we get an appointment?" he asked. Dr. Morrison's expression was apologetic. Their wait list is usually 6 to 8 weeks for new patients, but with the priority referral, hopefully within 3 weeks. 3 weeks. 21 days of listening to Sophie struggle to breathe at night, of watching her tire easily during activities she'd handled fine a month ago, of administering medication that wasn't working well enough. Sophie, sitting on the examination table with her legs dangling, seemed unconcerned. "Can we get ice cream after this, Dad?" "Sure, sweetheart," Mark said, his voice steady despite the fear coiling in his chest. "Whatever flavor you want." They stopped at the ice cream shop on the way home, Sophie chattering about school, while Mark smiled and responded, and tried not to think about his daughter's labored breathing or the way she'd had to stop twice on the walk from the parking lot because she was winded. That night, Sophie woke at 2 a.m. coughing. Mark was beside her bed in seconds, helping her sit up, administering her rescue inhaler, rubbing her back while she fought to catch her breath. It took 20 minutes for the episode to pass, Sophie finally falling back asleep, leaning against him, exhausted from the effort of breathing. Mark stayed awake watching her, counting her respirations, listening to the wheeze that shouldn't be there, and feeling helpless in a way he hadn't since Sarah's final weeks in the hospital. He couldn't wait 3 weeks. Sophie needed help now, needed a specialist who could figure out what was wrong and fix it before it got worse. But the pulmonologist doctor Morrison recommended was the best in the city, and the best came with wait lists and gatekeeping and systems designed to protect doctors' time rather than accommodate parents' fear. At 3 a.m., sitting in Sophie's room with his phone casting blue light across the darkness, Mark pulled up Evelyn's contact information. He stared at her number for a long moment, pride warring with pragmatism, independence fighting necessity. Evelyn had said anything, had promised she was in his corner, had given him her personal number and told him to use it when life threw curveballs he couldn't handle alone. Mark took a breath and typed, "This is Mark Reynolds. I'm sorry to reach out like this, but my daughter needs a specialist and the wait is 3 weeks. She can't wait that long. If you know anyone who could help us get an earlier appointment, I would be grateful. I understand if this is asking too much." He sent the message before he could overthink it, then sat in Sophie's room feeling the weight of having broken his own rule about self-sufficiency. The response came 15 minutes later. Not asking too much at all. Which specialist and what condition? We'll make calls first thing in the morning. Mark provided the details, relief and residual pride creating an uncomfortable mix in his chest. He was accepting help from a billionaire because his daughter was sick, and the medical system moved too slowly for emergencies that weren't technically emergencies yet. "Thank you," he typed. "Really? Don't thank me until it's handled. Try to get some rest. We'll figure this out." Mark didn't rest. He sat with Sophie until dawn, watching her breathe, and when his alarm went off at 7 a.m., he called in sick to work for the first time in 2 years. Darius answered with concern rather than irritation. "Everything okay?" "Sophie's having asthma problems. Need to stay home with her. Take whatever time you need. Family first, always." Mark got Sophie ready for school despite his instinct to keep her home, recognizing that maintaining routine was important and that missing school would just worry her. He walked her to class, spoke quietly with her teacher about the situation, and extracted a promise that someone would call immediately if Sophie had any breathing difficulties. "We'll watch her closely," Mrs. Patterson assured him. "And Mark? She's going to be okay. Kids are resilient." He wanted to believe her, but resilience had limits. Sarah had been resilient too, had fought until fighting wasn't enough anymore. Back at the apartment, Mark's phone rang. Evelyn, calling at 9 a.m. exactly. "I spoke with Dr. Chen's office," she said without preamble. "They can see Sophie today at 2 p.m. if you can make it. I explained the situation and they're squeezing you in." Mark sat down heavily on his couch, overwhelmed by the speed of the solution. "Today? How did you—" "I've donated to Children's Respiratory Center for years. That comes with certain considerations when I call asking for favors." Evelyn's tone was matter-of-fact. "I hope that's all right. I know you value doing things on your own, but Sophie needs help and I could provide it." "It's more than all right," Mark said, his throat tight. "Thank you. I don't know what else to say except thank you." "You don't need to say anything else. Just get Sophie to that appointment. Dr. Chen is genuinely excellent. If anyone can figure out what's wrong and fix it, she can." They talked for a few more minutes, Evelyn asking careful questions about Sophie's symptoms and Mark providing details with the precision of a parent who'd been monitoring every breath. When they hung up, Mark immediately called Sophie's school to arrange early pickup, then sat with his head in his hands, feeling gratitude and relief and the particular exhaustion that came from constant worry. He picked Sophie up at 1 p.m., telling her they had a special doctor's appointment with someone who was really good at helping kids breathe better. Sophie, who'd been through enough medical appointments to be wary of them, looked uncertain but didn't protest. Children's Respiratory Center was in the medical complex downtown, bright and modern with colorful murals designed to make young patients less anxious. Mark checked in at the reception desk, half expecting some complication or delay, but the receptionist simply smiled and said Dr. Chen would see them shortly. They waited only 10 minutes before a nurse called Sophie's name. Dr. Chen was a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and an efficiency that reminded Mark of Evelyn's assistant Rachel. She spent an hour examining Sophie, asking detailed questions, running tests, listening to her breathing with focused attention. Sophie, I'm going to have you work with my respiratory therapist for a few minutes while I talk to your dad, okay? Dr. Chen said gently. She's going to do some fun breathing exercises with you. After Sophie left with the therapist, Dr. Chen turned to Mark with an expression that was serious but not grim. Her asthma has progressed from moderate to severe. The good news is that it's treatable with the right medication combination. The bad news is that her current treatment plan isn't sufficient anymore. Mark nodded, trying to focus on the good news part. What needs to change? We'll start her on a different controller medication, add a long-acting bronchodilator, and I want to see her weekly for the first month to make sure we're getting the dosing right. I'm also going to refer you to our asthma education program. They'll teach Sophie techniques for managing episodes and help you both understand triggers better. Whatever she needs, Mark said immediately. Cost isn't... He paused, mentally calculating his savings and health insurance coverage. I'll figure it out. Dr. Chen's expression softened. The education program is free, and I'm going to prescribe generic medications wherever possible to keep costs down. We also have a patient assistance program if the out-of-pocket becomes unmanageable. Let's get Sophie stable first, then we'll worry about the rest. They talked for another 20 minutes, Dr. Chen explaining the new treatment plan with thoroughness that made Mark feel like he was actually being heard rather than processed. When Sophie returned, pink-cheeked from the breathing exercises, Dr. Chen knelt down to her level. Sophie, we're going to change your medicine to help you breathe better. It might take a little while to work perfectly, but I promise it will help. And I'm going to teach you some cool tricks for when breathing feels hard. Deal? Deal, Sophie agreed, her trust in the competent doctor immediate and complete. Walking out of the medical center with new prescriptions and a follow-up appointment scheduled for the following week, Mark felt lighter than he had in days. The problem wasn't solved yet, but it was being addressed by someone who knew exactly what she was doing, and that was everything. His phone rang. Evelyn again. How did it go? She asked. Mark found himself smiling despite everything. Really well. Dr. Chen is amazing. She figured out what's wrong and has a plan to fix it. We're starting new medications and coming back weekly. That's wonderful. Evelyn's relief was audible. I'm so glad she could help. This wouldn't have happened without you, Mark said, the acknowledgement easier now that Sophie was getting the care she needed. We'd still be waiting 3 weeks while she got worse. You made this possible. I made a phone call, Evelyn said, but her voice carried quiet pleasure. You did the hard part, recognizing she needed help and advocating for her. Still, thank you. Mark watched Sophie skip ahead toward the car, already seeming brighter now that help was coming. I know I've been resistant to accepting help from you, but I'm grateful you offered it anyway. You're welcome. And Mark? You're not resistant to help. You're appropriately cautious about obligations and strings, but there aren't any strings here, just someone who's glad to be able to return the favor you did for me. After they hung up, Mark drove home feeling like something fundamental had shifted. He'd reached out for help and received it without judgment or obligation, had accepted support without sacrificing his independence or dignity. Maybe the world was more generous than his experience had taught him, or maybe he'd just been lucky enough to encounter someone who understood the difference between help and charity. Over the next month, Sophie's condition improved steadily. The new medications worked, her breathing episodes decreased, and color returned to her cheeks. Mark took her to weekly appointments with Dr. Chen, attended the asthma education program, and learned techniques for managing her condition that he wished he'd known years ago. The medical bills were significant but manageable with payment plans, and when the patient assistance program covered 30% of the medication costs, Mark felt the financial pressure ease slightly. He picked up extra shifts when he could, grateful for the overtime pay and the distraction of physical work. Evelyn checked in periodically with brief texts, "How's Sophie doing?" or "Any improvement?" and Mark responded with honest updates. The communication was easy and undemanding, neither of them trying to build it into more than it was. Two people who'd connected through unusual circumstances maintaining a friendly concern for each other's well-being. In mid-February, Mark's phone rang with an unknown number. He almost didn't answer, memories of the media circus still making him wary, but something made him pick up. "Mr. Reynolds, this is Catherine Park from Quantum Dynamics Community Partnership Division. Miss Cross suggested I reach out to you about a potential opportunity. Mark's guard went up immediately. What kind of opportunity? We're developing a workplace safety training program for our logistics and facilities staff. Ms. Cross mentioned you have extensive first aid training and real-world emergency experience. We're looking for someone to help design the curriculum and potentially lead training sessions. It would be contract work, flexible hours, and competitive compensation. Mark sat down slowly, processing the offer. Did Evelyn, Ms. Cross, create this position for me? Catherine laughed. Actually, no. The program has been in development for 6 months. But when Ms. Cross heard about it, she immediately thought of you and asked me to reach out. Whether you're interested is entirely up to you. No pressure either way. Can I think about it? Of course. I'll email you details and you can let me know. Take whatever time you need. After hanging up, Mark sat with the information, turning it over in his mind. Contract work with flexible hours would mean better pay than the warehouse and a schedule that accommodated Sophie's needs more easily. It would mean using skills he actually had rather than just physical labor. It would mean opportunities he'd stopped imagining were possible for someone with his background. But it also meant accepting help from Evelyn again, meant moving further into her orbit, meant complicating the careful boundaries he'd maintained. He called her that evening, after Sophie was asleep. "Did you create a job for me?" he asked without preamble. "I did not," Evelyn said firmly. "I suggested you for an existing position because you're genuinely qualified and they need someone with real experience. Whether you want it is your decision." "It feels like charity." "It's not charity if you're qualified and they need what you can offer. That's just employment." Evelyn paused. "Mark, I understand your pride. I respect it, actually. But sometimes opportunities come through connections, and that's not charity. That's how the world works. I wouldn't have suggested you if I didn't think you could do the job well." Mark thought about that, about the difference between being given something and being connected to something you'd earned through competence. What if I'm not good at it? Curriculum design and training sessions? That's not what I do. Then you'll learn. The same way you learned to handle Sophie's asthma emergencies. The same way you learned the Heimlich well enough to save my life. You're capable, Mark. You just need to believe it. The confidence in her voice surprised him, this near stranger who somehow saw potential he'd stopped seeing in himself. "I'll think about it," he said finally. "That's all I'm asking." Mark thought about it for 3 days, weighing pride against pragmatism, independence against opportunity. He researched quantum dynamics' workplace safety record, looked up similar training positions, tried to assess whether this was something he could actually succeed at or whether he'd be set up for failure. Finally, he called Catherine Park back and accepted the position on a trial basis, 3 months to develop the curriculum and run pilot training sessions, after which both sides could decide whether to continue. The work was challenging in ways the warehouse had never been. Mark had to translate his practical knowledge into teachable material, had to stand in front of groups and present with authority rather than just demonstrate with his hands. But Catherine was patient and supportive. The other staff treated him with respect rather than skepticism, and slowly Mark began to believe he might actually be good at this. Sophie noticed the change in him, less exhausted, more engaged, home for dinner most nights instead of sleeping before evening shifts. "You seem happy, Dad," she said one night while they were doing dishes together. "I am happy," Mark realized, surprised by the truth of it. "Work is different now, better." "Because of the lady you saved?" Mark paused, considering how to explain the complex web of connection and opportunity that had grown from a single moment in a restaurant. "Sort of. She introduced me to people who needed help with something I knew how to do. But I still had to do the work myself." "That's nice," Sophie said with a child's simple understanding. "When people help each other, everything works better." Out of the mouths of 8-year-olds, Mark thought, came wisdom that adults spent years trying to recapture. By spring, Sophie's asthma was well controlled, Mark was thriving in his new position, and life had settled into patterns more sustainable than the barely managed chaos he'd lived with for years. He still valued independence, still maintained careful boundaries, but he'd learned that accepting help didn't make you weak. It made you smart enough to recognize when collaboration made everyone stronger. Evelyn and Mark maintained their sporadic communication, brief texts checking in on Sophie's health or Mark's work. the occasional coffee when their schedules aligned, and Evelyn was curious about the training program's progress. They weren't friends exactly. Their lives were too different for casual friendship, but they'd become something more meaningful. Two people who'd connected through crisis and chosen to maintain connection through mutual respect. One Saturday in April, Mark brought Sophie to Quantum Dynamics for the annual Family Day, an event where employees could show their children where they worked. Sophie was fascinated by the gleaming technology campus, the innovation labs, the cafeteria that served actually good food. "This is where you work now?" she asked, eyes wide. "Part of the time," Mark confirmed. "The training center is in a different building, but this is the main campus." Evelyn appeared across the courtyard dressed casually for the family event, talking with a group of employees' children about the robots they were designing. She caught Mark's eye and smiled, excusing herself to walk over. "You must be Sophie," Evelyn said, kneeling down to the girl's level. "Your dad talks about you all the time." Sophie, never shy, studied Evelyn with open curiosity. "Are you the lady my dad saved?" "I am," Evelyn confirmed. "And I'm very grateful to him. He's a pretty amazing person." "I know," Sophie said matter-of-factly. "He's the best dad ever." Mark felt his throat tighten, watching his daughter's absolute confidence in him, reflected in Evelyn's approving smile. This was what success looked like, he realized, not money or status or recognition, but a happy child who felt loved and secure, and work that mattered, and connections built on genuine respect rather than transactional necessity. "Would you like to see the innovation lab?" Evelyn asked Sophie. "We've got some pretty cool robots in there." Sophie looked at Mark for permission, and he nodded. "Go ahead, I'll catch up." As Sophie ran ahead with Evelyn toward the lab, Mark stood in the courtyard of this place he now partially belonged to, feeling the spring sunshine warm on his face. 6 months ago, he'd saved a stranger's life in a moment of crisis, and then tried to return to invisibility. But life had other plans. The invisible hero had been found, had been helped, had been given opportunities he'd stopped believing existed for someone like him. And in accepting those opportunities, he'd discovered something important. That sometimes the bravest thing wasn't refusing help, but accepting it with grace, wasn't maintaining independence at all costs, but recognizing when connection made everyone stronger. He walked toward the innovation lab, where he could hear Sophie's delighted laughter and Evelyn's patient explanations, and felt profound gratitude for the strange path that had led them all here. Not to some dramatic conclusion or grand gesture, but to an ordinary Saturday where a father watched his daughter explore possibilities he wanted her to believe were available to everyone, not just the privileged few. 2 years later, Mark stood in front of a conference room full of warehouse supervisors from companies across the region, presenting the workplace safety curriculum that had become his unexpected expertise. The program he'd helped develop had reduced workplace injuries at Quantum Dynamics by 40% in its first year, and now other companies wanted to replicate the success. "The key is treating safety knowledge as essential rather than optional," Mark was saying, his confidence in public speaking hard-won but genuine. "Every employee should know basic first aid, emergency response, and how to recognize when someone needs help. It's not complicated, it's just necessary." After the presentation, several supervisors approached with questions, and Mark found himself in the strange position of being treated as an expert rather than just a warehouse worker who'd gotten lucky. It was still slightly surreal, but he'd learned to accept his own competence without dismissing it as accident or charity. Sophie was 10 now. Her asthma managed so well that she'd joined the school soccer team. She still had occasional episodes, but she knew how to handle them, and Mark had taught her coaches the same emergency protocols he now taught to corporate employees across the region. Mark's relationship with Evelyn had evolved into something comfortably undefined. Not quite friendship, not professional exactly, but a genuine connection built on mutual respect and the shared understanding that sometimes people came into your life for reasons you couldn't predict and stayed for reasons that mattered. They had coffee once a month or so. Evelyn interested in the training program's expansion, and Mark curious about the technological innovations Quantum was developing. Evelyn had started a foundation focused on workplace safety and emergency preparedness, and Mark served on the advisory board, his practical experience balancing the theoretical knowledge of academic consultants. "You've come a long way from refusing free meals," Evelyn teased over coffee one afternoon. I still refuse free meals, Mark countered. I paid for this coffee. True, Evelyn smiled, but you stopped refusing opportunities. Because someone persistent kept offering them until I was smart enough to accept. You were always smart enough. You just needed to believe you deserved them. Mark considered that, thinking about the Mark from 2 years ago who'd measured success purely in terms of Sophie's well-being and his own independence. That Mark hadn't been wrong, exactly, but he'd been limited by assumptions about what was possible for someone with his background and circumstances. Thank you, he said, the words carrying weight beyond this single conversation, for everything, for seeing potential I didn't see, for not giving up when I was stubborn about accepting help, for protecting Sophie when she needed it. You already thanked me, Evelyn said gently, about 100 times over the past 2 years. I know, but some things deserve repeated gratitude. Evelyn's phone buzzed with a reminder. I have a board meeting in 20 minutes, but before I go, the foundation is hosting a gala next month, fundraiser for expanding the safety programs to underserved communities. Would you and Sophie like to come? Not as my guest, she added quickly, seeing his expression. As a member of the advisory board, you're supposed to be there anyway, but I thought Sophie might enjoy it. Mark smiled. She'd love it. She's been asking when she gets to wear the fancy dress we bought for her friend's bat mitzvah. Perfect. I'll have Rachel send you the details. After Evelyn left, Mark sat in the coffee shop a while longer, watching the city move past the windows. His life had changed in ways he never could have anticipated that night in Luminaire, but the core of who he was remained the same. He was still Sophie's dad first and foremost, still valued independence and dignity, still measured success in terms of whether his daughter was happy and safe. But he'd added new layers to that foundation: professional competence, meaningful work, connections that enriched rather than complicated, and the understanding that accepting help when you needed it wasn't weakness but wisdom. The invisible hero had never wanted to be visible, had never sought recognition or reward. But visibility had found him anyway, and in accepting it with grace, he'd discovered that you could be seen without being diminished, could accept help without surrendering independence, could build connections that enhanced your life rather than limiting it. The foundation gala was held in a hotel ballroom that made Luminaire look modest by comparison. Sophie wore her fancy dress and stared wide-eyed at the chandeliers, the flower arrangements that probably cost more than Mark's monthly rent, the people in designer clothes talking about million-dollar donations like they were discussing lunch orders. This is fancy, Sophie whispered, clutching Mark's hand. Very fancy, Mark agreed. But remember, they're just people, same as everyone else. Evelyn found them near the entrance, looking elegant in a midnight blue gown, but still somehow approachable. Sophie, you look beautiful, and Mark, you clean up well. Mark glanced down at his rented tuxedo, still slightly uncomfortable in formal wear. I feel like I'm playing dress-up. Everyone here is playing dress-up, Evelyn said quietly. That's the secret of these events. We're all performing versions of ourselves. You're just more honest about the performance. The gala proceeded with the choreographed precision of events organized by professionals. Dinner, speeches, the auction raising absurd amounts of money for safety programs that would genuinely save lives. Mark found himself seated at a table with other advisory board members, introducing Sophie to philanthropists and corporate executives who treated her with genuine warmth rather than condescension. During the presentation about the foundation's work, a video played showing workplace safety training sessions, including footage of Mark teaching emergency response to a group of warehouse workers. Seeing himself on the massive screen was jarring, but the genuine engagement of the workers he was teaching, the practical value of what he was sharing, made Mark feel proud rather than embarrassed. That's my dad, Sophie said loudly enough that several nearby tables turned to look, and Mark felt his face heat with a blush even as he smiled at his daughter's uncomplicated pride. After dinner, Evelyn took the stage for closing remarks. 2 years ago, I experienced a moment of crisis that could have ended very differently. I'm standing here tonight because one person acted with calm competence when everyone else froze. That experience taught me something important about the value of preparation, training, and the willingness to help strangers without expecting reward. She paused, her gaze finding Mark in the crowd. The invisible hero didn't want recognition then, and probably doesn't want it now. but he deserves it anyway. Not just for that single moment of crisis, but for the work he's done since to make sure others have the knowledge and skills to act in their own moments of crisis. Mark Reynolds, would you join me up here? Mark froze, every instinct screaming to refuse, to stay invisible, to avoid the spotlight. But Sophie was tugging his hand, eyes bright with excitement, and he couldn't disappoint her. He stood and walked to the stage, hyper-aware of hundreds of eyes watching, feeling exposed in a way he'd spent 2 years trying to avoid. Evelyn handed him a plaque, some kind of foundation recognition award, but more importantly, she handed him the microphone with an expectant look that said she knew he had something worth saying if he could find the courage to say it. Mark looked out at the crowd, at Sophie's proud face, at Evelyn's encouraging smile, and found his voice. "I'm not comfortable with being called a hero," he began, his voice steadier than he'd expected. "What I did in that restaurant was basic first aid. What matters is that everyone should know basic first aid, because emergencies don't care about your job title or bank account. They just happen, and we all need to be ready." He glanced at the plaque, then back at the audience. 2 years ago, I saved someone's life and tried to disappear because I didn't think I deserved recognition. But I was wrong about that. Not because I'm special, but because we should recognize everyone who steps up in crisis. The EMTs and firefighters and teachers who know CPR. The parents who learn the Heimlich because their kids have allergies. The coworkers who take first aid classes on their own time. Those people are heroes too, and they deserve resources and training and support. Sophie was beaming, and Mark felt something unlock in his chest. The last remnants of shame about accepting help, about being visible, about believing his knowledge and experience had value worth sharing. So thank you to Ms. Cross and this foundation for creating programs that give people those resources. And thank you to everyone here supporting this work. You're making it possible for ordinary people to be ready for extraordinary moments. That matters more than you probably realize. The applause was genuine and sustained, and Mark returned to his seat feeling lighter. Evelyn caught his eye from the stage and smiled, a look of profound satisfaction that said she'd known all along he had this in him. He just needed to believe it himself. After the gala, as Mark and Sophie were leaving, Evelyn walked them to their car, a newer model now, reliable and safe, purchased with the salary from his training position. "That was a good speech," Evelyn said, "honest and from the heart." "I meant every word." Mark buckled Sophie into the back seat, his daughter already drowsy from the excitement. "Thank you for pushing me to accept recognition. I still don't love it, but I understand why it matters. It matters because your story gives other people permission to believe they can make a difference too." Evelyn leaned against the car, the formal gala atmosphere fading into simple conversation between friends. 2 years ago, you saved my life and taught me that genuine altruism still exists. Tonight, you helped raise $500,000 for safety programs that will save other lives. That's worth celebrating. Mark considered the chain of events that had led from a choking incident in a restaurant to this moment. A gala, a foundation, programs expanding across the region, lives being saved by people who'd learned skills they'd never thought to acquire. "We make a good team," he said, surprising himself with the acknowledgement. "Your resources and vision, my practical experience and stubbornness." "The stubbornness is essential," Evelyn agreed, laughing. "Keeps me honest." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the city's nighttime energy humming around them. Then Sophie's sleepy voice came from the back seat. "Dad, can we come to another fancy party sometime?" "Maybe," Mark said, smiling. "If Ms. Cross invites us." "You're always invited," Evelyn said warmly. "Both of you, consider it a standing offer." Driving home with Sophie dozing in the back seat, Mark thought about standing offers and unexpected connections and the ways life surprised you when you stopped trying to control every outcome. He'd saved a stranger's life, and in doing so had somehow saved his own, not from physical danger, but from the limited vision of what was possible for someone like him. The invisible hero was visible now, and that was okay. Being seen meant opportunities to help others, to share knowledge, to make a difference beyond his own small circle. It meant Sophie growing up believing that her father's competence mattered, that ordinary people could do extraordinary things, that help freely given and gracefully accepted made everyone stronger. He'd never forget the terror of watching Evelyn choke, the adrenaline of performing the Heimlich, the surreal aftermath of viral fame. But what he'd remember most was the quiet aftermath. The connections formed, the opportunities accepted, the gradual understanding that independence and community weren't opposites, but complementary parts of a life well lived. 5 years after the incident at Luminaire, Mark stood in the training center he now directed, watching a new cohort of workplace safety instructors practice emergency response protocols. The program had expanded beyond quantum dynamics to become an independent nonprofit, training thousands of workers annually and reducing preventable workplace injuries across dozens of companies. Sophie was 13 now, thriving in middle school, her asthma a managed condition rather than a constant threat. She'd started volunteering at the training center on weekends, helping with administrative work and absorbing knowledge about emergency preparedness with the easy competence of someone who'd grown up around it. Mark's phone rang. Evelyn, calling from somewhere overseas where Quantum was expanding operations. "How's the new instructor cohort looking?" she asked. "Promising. 3 of them are former warehouse workers like me, which brings great practical perspective." Mark watched through the observation window as an instructor guided trainees through proper CPR technique. "We're also piloting a program for restaurants, teaching staff to recognize choking and perform the Heimlich." "Closing the circle," Evelyn observed. "I like the poetry of that." They talked for a few more minutes about foundation business, about Sophie's academic achievements, about the ordinary details of lives that had become extraordinarily intertwined through a moment of crisis 5 years earlier. After hanging up, Mark sat in his office, a real office with his name on the door and certificates on the wall documenting expertise he'd earned through experience and formal training, and felt profound gratitude for the unexpected path his life had taken. He'd started as a warehouse worker trying to provide for his daughter, measuring success in terms of bills paid and basic stability achieved. He'd evolved into someone who trained others, whose knowledge saved lives, whose story inspired people to believe they could make a difference. The invisible hero had become visible, had accepted recognition, had used the platform he'd never wanted to create genuine positive change in the world. And in doing so, he'd discovered that heroism wasn't about grand gestures or seeking recognition. It was about consistent competence, willingness to help, and the courage to accept that sometimes your knowledge and experience had value worth sharing. Sophie appeared in his office doorway, backpack slung over one shoulder. "Ready to go home, Dad?" "Absolutely." Mark stood, gathering his things. "What do you want for dinner?" "Can we try that new Thai place? Emma says it's really good." "Sure. My treat." Walking to the car with his teenage daughter, Mark thought about the invisible hero he'd once been and the visible advocate he'd become. The journey between those identities had been unexpected and often uncomfortable, but it had been worth it, because visibility meant impact, recognition meant opportunity, and accepting help with grace meant you could help others more effectively than you ever could alone. Evelyn Cross had saved his life just as surely as he'd saved hers, not from physical danger, but from the limiting belief that accepting support diminished independence, or that ordinary people couldn't create extraordinary change. And 5 years later, looking at the training center that bore both their names on its donor wall, looking at his daughter who'd grown up believing she could be anything she wanted, looking at the life he'd built from a single moment of crisis and the connections that had grown from it, Mark Reynolds understood something profound. True heroism wasn't about being invisible or visible. It was about being present, showing up when needed, accepting help when offered, giving help when able, and recognizing that we're all connected in ways that make everyone stronger when we choose connection over isolation. The invisible hero had learned to be visible, and in doing so, he'd helped make countless others visible too. Ordinary people doing extraordinary things, one emergency response, one safety protocol, one moment of courage at a time. It was, Mark thought, as he drove home with Sophie chattering about her day, a pretty good legacy for someone who just wanted to eat a quiet dinner and disappear back into ordinary life. Sometimes the best stories were the ones where ordinary people discovered they were capable of extraordinary things. And sometimes those stories never really ended. They just kept rippling outward, touching lives in ways you never anticipated, building connections that transformed everyone involved. Mark Reynolds, the invisible hero who'd become visible, had learned that lesson well. And in learning it, he'd taught it to thousands of others who would carry it forward into their own moments of crisis, their own opportunities to help, their own journeys from isolation to connection. That was the real happy ending. Not dramatic or spectacular, but quiet and sustainable and genuinely good. The kind of ending that felt like a beginning, full of possibility and purpose, and the simple joy of knowing you'd made a difference that would outlast you. And as the sun set over the city, painting everything in shades of gold and amber, Mark drove toward home with his daughter beside him, grateful for every unexpected turn that had brought them here and excited for wherever the journey would lead next.